Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Living by yourself at 26 comes with its own set of rules, especially when you're a freelance photographer who keeps odd hours and forgets things constantly. The little brick duplex on Birch Avenue had been my sanctuary for almost 2 years, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood where the biggest excitement was usually someone's cat getting stuck on a roof. My landlord, an elderly man named Harold, lived 3 states away and basically let me do whatever I wanted as long as the rent came on time. The spare key under the ceramic frog planter by my front door had been my safety net since my college dorm days, a habit I carried with me through 3 different apartments because I'd locked myself out more times than I care to admit. That Friday in October started like any other, except for the weather turning nasty around lunch. The rain came down in sheets while I was shooting an outdoor wedding that got moved inside last minute, leaving everyone stressed and me soaking wet despite my umbrella. By the time I got home around 9 that evening, my fingers were so numb I could barely grip my actual key. The porch light was already on, which seemed odd since I specifically remembered turning it off that morning to save electricity. When I turned the doorknob, it opened without resistance. The door was completely unlocked. My first thought was annoyance at myself because this wasn't the first time I'd rushed out and forgotten to lock up properly, though usually I at least remembered doing it. The house felt different the moment I stepped inside, like the air pressure had changed, or someone had rearranged the molecules in the space while I was gone. The living room lamp was on, the one with the finicky switch that you had to jiggle just right to make it work, casting long shadows across my photography equipment stacked in the corner. My laptop was still on the coffee table, but it was closed now, and I distinctly remembered leaving it open with my editing software running because I'd planned to finish touching up those engagement photos tonight. The throw pillows on my couch were perfectly arranged, which was bizarre because I never bothered fixing them, just left them however they landed when I got up. Even my coffee mug from the morning was cleaned and sitting in the dish rack, and I definitely hadn't washed it. My cat Phantom usually came running the second I walked through the door, meowing like I'd abandoned him for years instead of hours. But tonight I found him crouched under the dining table, his yellow eyes wide and his black fur standing up along his spine like he'd been electrocuted. When I reached for him, he hissed at me, before darting upstairs. In the 2 years since I'd adopted him from the shelter, he'd never acted like that, not even when the vet had to give him shots. The rain kept hammering against the windows, and somewhere in the house I heard what sounded like footsteps above me, but I told myself it was just water in the gutters or the old pipes doing their thing. The kitchen was where things got really weird. Every single cabinet door was open about 3 inches, not thrown wide, just cracked uniformly like someone had gone through checking what was inside each one. My knife block on the counter had 1 empty slot, the big chef's knife missing, and I knew for certain it had been there this morning because I'd used it to cut an apple. The trash can had been moved from its usual spot by the sink to the middle of the floor, and inside were things I didn't recognize: an empty can of soup I never bought, a crumpled receipt from a gas station 20 miles away, and strangest of all, a pair of latex gloves turned inside out. My appetite vanished completely, replaced by this crawling sensation across my scalp like insects were nesting in my hair. Upstairs, my bedroom door was closed, which was wrong because I always left it open for Phantom to come and go as he pleased. Through the door, I could hear something, a rhythmic sound barely audible over the storm outside. It took me a full minute standing there in the hallway, my ear almost pressed against the wood, to realize what it was. Breathing. Slow, deep breathing, like someone sleeping or trying very hard to stay calm. My rational brain kept insisting it had to be the wind or the house settling, but my body knew better. Every muscle in my legs was screaming at me to run, to get out of the house right now, but I couldn't move. The doorknob was cold under my palm when I finally touched it, colder than it should have been, and when I started to turn it, the breathing stopped. The door swung open to reveal my bedroom exactly as I'd left it that morning, except for the man sitting on the edge of my bed. He was maybe 40, wearing a rain-soaked windbreaker and jeans, his thinning hair plastered to his skull. His shoes had left wet prints across my carpet, creating a trail from the window to the bed. In his lap was my missing chef's knife, and he was running his thumb along the blade's edge with the practiced motion of someone who'd done it 1,000 times before. When he looked up at me, his eyes were the pale blue of winter ice, completely empty of any emotion I could recognize. He didn't jump or act surprised to see me. Instead, he smiled, not menacing or crazy, just pleasant, like we were old friends meeting for coffee. "You're home earlier than usual," he said in this conversational tone, as if we did this every Friday night. The wedding must have wrapped up quick. That's when it hit me like a physical blow to the chest. He knew where I'd been. He knew my schedule. This wasn't some random break-in by a stranger who'd gotten lucky finding my spare key. This man had been watching me, learning my routines, maybe for weeks or months. The ceramic frog with the key had been slightly crooked when I'd come home, I realize now, not quite in its usual position against the planter. He stood up slowly, still holding the knife but not threatening with it, just carrying it like you'd carry a book or a phone. "I've been keeping the place tidy for you," he continued, taking a step toward me. "I noticed you're always so tired when you come home. Those dishes were piling up, and the living room needed straightening." His voice was soft, almost caring, which made everything infinitely worse. Behind me, Phantom yowled from somewhere down the hall, a sound of pure animal terror. My phone was in my back pocket, but reaching for it seemed impossible with him watching me so intently. He must have seen me glance toward the stairs because he shook his head gently, like a parent correcting a child. "You don't need to leave," he said, moving past me into the hallway, close enough that I could smell him. A mixture of rain, cigarette smoke, and something medicinal like cough syrup. "I made soup earlier, it's still warm on the stove. You haven't been eating properly, just coffee and those protein bars." He knew what I ate. He'd been in my house when I was gone, going through my trash, my refrigerator, learning every detail of my life. My legs finally responded, and I bolted down the stairs, taking them 3 at a time, my socks sliding on the wood. Behind me, his footsteps followed. Not running, just walking steadily, unhurried. The front door was locked. Not just locked, but deadbolted from the inside, and my keys were upstairs in my camera bag. The back door through the kitchen was my only option, but when I reached it, yanking on the handle, it wouldn't budge. He'd done something to it, jammed it somehow. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, still carrying the knife loosely at his side. "I grew up in this house," he said quietly, leaning against the door frame. "My parents owned it for 30 years before they died, and it became a rental. I still have all the original keys, even the ones to locks that were supposedly changed." He pulled out a key ring from his pocket, dozens of keys jangling together. That ceramic frog was my mother's. She kept her spare key there too. His eyes drifted around the kitchen with this nostalgic look. "You've changed so much, but I can still see how it used to be. My bedroom was upstairs where yours is now. Sometimes I come here when you're at work and just sit in there, remembering." The window above the kitchen sink was small but maybe big enough. While he was lost in his memories, talking about Sunday dinners and birthday parties that happened decades ago, I grabbed a chair and climbed up. The window was painted shut, layers and layers of old paint sealing it like cement. I slammed my elbow against the glass, shattering it, feeling the shards cut through my sleeve. The rain poured in immediately, cold and shocking. He didn't try to stop me, just watched with this disappointed expression as I cleared the broken glass with a dish towel and forced myself through the opening. I felt my ribs scraping against the frame, my hip catching on something sharp. But then, I was falling into the muddy flower bed outside. The neighbor's house was lit up next door, maybe 50 feet away. I ran barefoot through the yard, screaming for help, not caring how crazy I looked. Behind me, I heard the back door finally open. He must have unjammed it, and his calm voice calling out, "I'll see you tomorrow then." I spent that night at my neighbor's house while the police searched my home. They found evidence that he'd been coming and going for at least 6 months. Receipts hidden in the attic, a sleeping bag in the crawl space, even a journal where he'd written down my daily activities. Harold, my landlord, was shocked when they called him. He swore he'd changed all the locks when he bought the place 5 years ago. But the locksmith they brought in showed us how some of the internal mechanisms were original, probably from the 60s. The man, his name was Gregory Dalton, was arrested at his apartment the next morning, surrounded by photos of my house from every angle, including some taken from inside while I was sleeping. The ceramic frog planter turned out to be the key to everything. His mother really had owned it, and when he saw it in the same spot decades later, something in his mind had snapped. He genuinely believed he still lived there, that I was just a guest who'd stayed too long. The police found 3 other spare keys he'd made, hidden around the property in places only someone who'd grown up there would know. Inside a fake rock by the basement window, under a loose brick in the back walkway, even one in the garage rafters. I moved out the next week, staying with my sister across town until I found a new place. An apartment on the 4th floor with a doorman and security cameras everywhere. No spare keys hidden anywhere, just a digital lock with a code I change every month. Gregory got 5 years for stalking and breaking and entering, but that's not what keeps me awake at night. It's knowing that for 6 months, while I was living my life, thinking I was safe in my own home, he was there too, washing my dishes, sitting on my bed, watching me sleep. The detective told me they found over 300 photos on his computer, documenting everything from my morning coffee routine to the way I arranged my pillows at night. Sometimes I still wake up at 3 in the morning, convinced I can hear breathing that isn't mine, even though I know it's impossible. Phantom never recovered from that night. He hides under furniture whenever anyone comes to visit, and he still won't go near windows. Last week I got a letter from Gregory in prison. I didn't open it, just handed it straight to the police, but I saw my name written on the envelope in neat, careful handwriting, and underneath it, in smaller letters, "I kept the house so nice for you." They tell me he'll probably be transferred to a psychiatric facility soon, but knowing he's locked up doesn't make me feel any safer. Because now I understand that the real horror isn't the stranger who breaks into your house. It's discovering they never thought they were breaking in at all. Last Friday night changed everything about how I see crowds, how I trust people in uniform, and why I'll never ignore my gut instinct again. The Riverside Arena downtown was hosting this indie rock show I'd been dying to see for months, and I'd gone alone because my roommate Ashley bailed last minute with a stomach bug. I almost didn't go myself, honestly, but I'd already paid for the ticket and figured why waste it. The venue was packed wall to wall with maybe 3,000 people. All of us crammed into that converted warehouse space that usually felt so intimate and electric. The opening band had just finished their set, and we were all waiting for the main act, this Portland-based group that had been climbing the charts for months. I remember standing near the middle section, close enough to see the stage but with a clear view of the main entrance I'd come through, and I was texting Ashley a photo of the crowd when everything went sideways. The fire alarm was so loud it felt like someone was drilling directly into my eardrums, those industrial sirens that make your whole body tense up instantly. People started looking around confused, some laughing nervously, others pulling out their phones to record what they thought was probably a prank or malfunction. Then these security guards appeared, but not the usual guys I recognized from previous shows. These were different, wearing black uniforms with reflective vests, moving through the crowd with this urgent, almost aggressive energy. They were shouting over the alarm, waving flashlights even though the house lights were still on, directing everyone away from the main entrance and toward the back of the venue. "Emergency evacuation, move to the rear exit, stay calm but move quickly," they kept repeating, their voices sharp and commanding. My 32 years of going to concerts had taught me where all the exits usually were in these venues, but I'd never seen security push everyone toward the back maintenance areas before. The crowd started shifting like a massive wave, bodies pressing together as everyone began moving in the same direction, and I felt myself getting swept along even though something in my chest was telling me this wasn't right. I caught a glimpse of one of the regular exit signs, the green ones that are always lit up above the side doors, pointing left toward what I knew was a proper fire exit that led straight to the parking lot. But these new security guards were herding us right, deeper into the building, toward a section I'd only ever seen venue staff use. The woman next to me, maybe college age with bright purple hair and a nose ring, grabbed my arm for balance as we got pushed forward, and I heard her ask one of the guards why we weren't using the normal exits. He didn't even look at her, just kept shouting, "Keep moving, emergency protocol, rear exit only," like he was some kind of recording on loop. The smell back there was different too. Not the usual mix of beer and sweat from the concert floor, but something stale and metallic, like old pipes and dust that hadn't been disturbed in years. We were being funneled into this narrow corridor with concrete walls, maybe 8 feet wide, and the temperature dropped noticeably as soon as we passed through the doorway. The further we went, the quieter the fire alarm became, muffled by the concrete and distance, which made no sense because shouldn't we be heading outside where it would be louder? I tried to stop, to turn around and push back through the crowd, but there were too many people behind me, all pressing forward with that mindless urgency that takes over in emergencies. The security guards had positioned themselves along the walls every 20 feet or so, their flashlights creating these harsh circles of light in what was becoming an increasingly dim space. The overhead fluorescents were spaced too far apart, leaving long stretches of shadow between them, and I noticed some weren't even working, just dark fixtures covered in years of grime. Someone's phone flashlight swept across the ceiling and I saw exposed pipes, some wrapped in what looked like ancient insulation, and water stains that spread out like diseased flowers across the concrete. The purple-haired girl was still next to me, and I heard her whisper to her boyfriend that this didn't feel like any evacuation route she'd ever seen, and he pulled her closer, his jaw tight with the same unease I was feeling in my bones. We must have been walking for 5 minutes, though it felt like hours, when the corridor took a sharp turn to the left and suddenly split into 2 passages. The security guards were directing people into both, splitting the crowd seemingly at random, and I watched as the purple-haired girl and her boyfriend got pushed into the left passage, while I got swept into the right. The panic really started to set in then, because fire evacuations don't work like this. They don't separate people, they don't take you deeper underground, and they definitely don't last this long. I could hear voices echoing from the other passage, getting fainter, and our group of maybe 300 people kept moving forward into what was becoming a maze of service tunnels. The walls were sweating now, beads of moisture running down the concrete like the building itself was nervous, and the air tasted wrong, recycled and thick like we were running out of oxygen. A man ahead of me tried to stop and ask one of the guards where exactly this exit was supposed to be, and the guard just pushed him forward, hard, causing him to stumble into the people in front of him. That's when I noticed their faces. The guards, I mean. Under those reflective vests and black uniforms, they all looked wrong somehow, like their features were too similar, too vacant, as if someone had hired a bunch of mannequins and taught them only 3 phrases to repeat. None of them were sweating despite the panic. None of them looked concerned about the supposed fire, and when one turned his flashlight toward his own face for a second, I saw his eyes were completely dilated, black pools that reflected nothing. My phone still had signal, barely 1 bar, and I tried to call 911, but the call wouldn't connect. Just gave me this weird, busy signal I'd never heard before, like static mixed with something breathing. Others were having the same problem. I could see them holding their phones up, trying to get signal. Their faces lit by screens showing emergency calls only or no service, even though we were still technically inside the city, inside a building that normally had perfect reception. The corridor narrowed again, forcing us to walk almost single file, and I felt the walls with my fingertips. They were cold and damp, and seemed to pulse with some kind of vibration, like there was machinery running somewhere behind them. People were starting to panic openly now, some crying, others shouting that they wanted to go back, but the guards just kept pushing us forward with this mechanical persistence that made my stomach churn. A woman in front of me, wearing a vintage band t-shirt and mom jeans, suddenly stopped and tried to turn around, screaming that her daughter was in the other group, that she needed to find her daughter. Two guards grabbed her arms and literally carried her forward while she kicked and screamed, and the rest of us just watched, too shocked or too scared to intervene. The corridor started sloping downward, gradual at first but then steeper, and I could hear water dripping somewhere in the darkness ahead, each drop echoing like a countdown to something terrible. My feet were starting to hurt from walking on the uneven concrete, and I realized we must have covered at least half a mile underground by now, maybe more, going deeper and deeper into what couldn't possibly be part of the original building structure. The air was getting thicker, harder to breathe, and people were starting to cough, that dry hacking sound that comes from bad air and fear combined. Then the lights went out completely, all at once, like someone had thrown a switch. The darkness was so absolute it felt like a physical weight pressing against my eyes, and the screaming started immediately, people pushing and shoving in pure animal panic. The guards' flashlights came on, but instead of helping, they made everything worse, the beams cutting through the darkness in sharp, disorienting angles that turned the crowd into a writhing mass of shadows and terrified faces. Someone fell near me and got trampled. I heard them crying out but couldn't see them, couldn't help them, could only keep moving forward or risk being crushed myself. The guards started chanting something in unison, not in English, not in any language I recognized, their voices harmonizing in this low, thrumming rhythm that seemed to make the walls vibrate even more. And then, suddenly there were doors, heavy metal doors slamming shut behind us with definitive bangs that echoed through the tunnel like gunshots. I heard them closing in sequence, boom, 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 cutting off any possibility of retreat, and someone near me started praying, their voice high and desperate in the darkness. The chanting from the guards stopped abruptly, and in the silence that followed, I could hear hundreds of people breathing, whimpering, shuffling in the dark like we were all trapped in the belly of some massive beast. Then new lights flickered on, but these weren't the harsh fluorescents from before. They were red emergency lights that bathed everything in this hellish glow that made everyone look like they were already covered in blood. We were in a large room now, maybe the size of a gymnasium, with concrete walls and a ceiling so high it disappeared into shadows. Metal folding chairs were arranged in perfect rows facing a small raised platform at the far end, and the guards were directing people to sit, their movements still mechanical, still wrong. But here's the thing that made my brain refuse to process what I was seeing. There were already people sitting in some of the chairs, completely still, facing forward, not turning to look at us newcomers even as we filed in crying and terrified. They wore regular clothes, jeans, and t-shirts and sneakers, but they sat with this unnatural stillness that made them look more like props than people. I tried to resist, to stay standing, but a guard's hand clamped down on my shoulder with crushing force and pushed me into a chair in the middle section. The metal was ice cold through my jeans, and I noticed there were straps attached to the armrests and legs, though they weren't fastened yet. The woman next to me, different from before, maybe in her 40s with graying hair and a ponytail, grabbed my hand and squeezed so hard I thought she might break my fingers. "This isn't real. This can't be real," she kept repeating, but we both knew it was. On the platform, a man appeared wearing a pristine white suit that seemed to glow under the red lights, his face obscured by shadows except for his mouth, which was stretched into this too wide smile that showed too many teeth. He raised his arms like a conductor about to begin a symphony, and the guards all stepped back against the walls in perfect synchronization. "Welcome," he said, his voice carrying impossibly well in the large space, seeming to come from everywhere at once, "to recruitment." My blood turned to ice water in my veins as I finally understood. This wasn't an evacuation, wasn't a kidnapping in any traditional sense, but something much worse. Something organized and planned and executed with terrifying precision. The man in white began speaking about purposes and positions, about how we'd been selected from specific demographic markers and psychological profiles built from our social media, our purchasing habits, our predictable Friday night routines. His words washed over me in waves of nonsense about corporate expansion and human resources and market optimization, but delivered with this evangelical fervor that made it sound like he was describing something holy. Behind him, a projection appeared on the wall showing logos I didn't recognize. Companies with names like Nexus Solutions and Paradigm Collective, corporate speak that meant nothing and everything. The still people in the chairs around us began to move their heads in unison, turning to look at us newcomers, and their eyes were empty, pupils blown wide just like the guards, their faces slack with whatever had been done to them. The woman still clutching my hand suddenly let go and stood up, her movements jerky like a marionette, and she walked to the front of the room and sat in one of the empty chairs in the first row, facing forward, going completely still. Others were doing the same, getting up one by one and finding empty seats closer to the platform, and I realized with growing horror that something in the air, maybe in the lights, maybe in his voice, was doing something to us. But then the real fire alarm went off. Not the fake one from before, but the actual building system, high and sharp and accompanied by the sprinkler system activating throughout the complex above us. The man in white's smile faltered for just a second, and the guards looked at each other with the first sign of confusion I'd seen from them. Water started seeping through cracks in the ceiling, and real smoke began filtering down through the ventilation system. Someone had set an actual fire, maybe on purpose, maybe by accident, but it broke whatever spell was being woven in that room. People started standing up, not in that puppet-like way, but with real panic rushing toward the doors we'd entered through. The guards tried to maintain order, but there were too many of us, and when the first person managed to break through their line, it was like a dam bursting. I ran with the crowd, pushing through the dark corridors as emergency lighting kicked in for real this time, following exit signs that hadn't been there before, or maybe I just hadn't seen them in my terror. We burst out through a loading dock into the parking lot, where fire trucks were already arriving, and I've never been so happy to see those flashing red lights that were real, attached to real emergency vehicles, with real firefighters who looked at us with genuine concern and confusion about why 300 people were pouring out of a supposedly empty section of the building. The official story was that someone had pulled a false alarm during the concert as a prank, causing a stampede that led us into restricted areas where we got lost in the service tunnels until the real fire started. The venue was shut down for fire code violations, and everyone got their ticket money refunded. But here's what haunts me. Out of the 3,000 people at that concert, only about 300 of us made it out of those tunnels. The others, including the purple-haired girl and her boyfriend, were never found. The police said they must have evacuated through different exits, but no security footage exists from that night, all mysteriously corrupted or erased. The security company that supposedly handled the evacuation doesn't exist in any business registry. Those corporations the man mentioned, Nexus Solutions and Paradigm Collective, they're real, they're massive, and they're connected to dozens of entertainment venues across the country. I've tried to warn people online, but my posts get deleted within hours, and twice now I've noticed men in black uniforms standing across from my apartment building, just watching. I moved cities, changed my phone number, deleted all my social media, but sometimes I still hear that chanting in my dreams, and I know they're still out there, still recruiting, still using concerts and crowds, and our need for entertainment to select and collect whatever they need us for. I don't go to shows anymore, don't go to movies, don't go anywhere with crowds and single exits, because now I know that sometimes the real danger isn't fire or stampedes or any normal emergency. It's the people who pretend to save you while leading you straight into something that has no name but definitely has a purpose. And that purpose involves turning regular people into those empty-eyed puppets sitting silent in rows, waiting for instructions that, hopefully, thankfully, never came for, me. The night everything went wrong started just like any other Friday evening, delivering packages for one of those big companies everyone knows. My route that particular evening in late November had me covering the southeastern district, mostly residential neighborhoods and a few office complexes that stayed open late. The van felt like a second home after 2 years of doing this job, with its familiar smell of cardboard and that one squeaky wheel that sang whenever I turned left. By 11:30 that night, I had just one package left to deliver, some electronics going to an address way out near the old factories. My wife Jessica had texted me earlier, asking when I'd be home because our daughter Lily couldn't sleep without her bedtime story from Daddy. I remember texting back that I'd be there by midnight, maybe 12:30 at the latest if traffic was bad. 34 years on this earth and I'd never broken a promise to my little girl. Wasn't about to start now. The highway stretched out ahead of me like a black ribbon, those orange streetlights creating little pools of light every 100 feet or so. My usual exit, Cranbrook Road, would take me straight home in about 20 minutes, but somehow in my exhaustion, and with my mind on Lily's bedtime story, I completely missed it. Didn't even realize until I saw the sign for Millwater Junction, which meant I'd gone about 3 miles too far. No big deal though, or at least that's what I thought at the time. The GPS on my phone showed a route through the industrial district that would actually shave off 5 minutes from my usual drive home. It looked simple enough on the screen, just a series of right turns through what used to be the manufacturing heart of our city, before most of the factories shut down in the early 2000s. The area wasn't completely abandoned. Some warehouses still operated during day shifts, but at this hour on a Friday night, it would be empty except for maybe a security guard or two doing rounds. The first 10 minutes went fine, just me and the hum of the van's engine echoing off the corrugated metal walls of abandoned buildings. Then the GPS started acting up, the little blue dot that represented my position jumping around the map like it couldn't figure out where I was. The signal bars dropped from 4 to 2, then to 1, and finally that dreaded message popped up. GPS signal lost, searching for connection. Great, just great. I pulled over next to what looked like an old textile factory, its windows all boarded up except for a few on the 3rd floor where the plywood had fallen off, leaving black holes that stared down at the street. The area was darker than I expected, with most of the streetlights either broken or just never replaced when they burned out. My headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but empty loading docks and rusted chain-link fences topped with razor wire that had gone brown with age. That's when I noticed him, standing next to a white panel truck about 50 feet ahead of where I'd stopped. The guy wasn't doing anything particularly strange, just standing there having a smoke, but finding anyone out here at this hour made me pause for a second. He wore dark work clothes, maybe navy blue or black, hard to tell in the dim light from the one functioning street light near his truck. As I sat there trying to get my phone to reconnect, he noticed me and started walking over with this casual, unhurried pace. Something about the way he moved reminded me of my Uncle Frank, who worked construction his whole life and had that same deliberate way of walking, like every step was planned out in advance. When he got close enough, I rolled down my window halfway, keeping the engine running just in case. He had one of those faces that could have been anywhere from 45 to 60, weathered and lined but not necessarily old, with gray stubble covering his jaw and deep-set eyes that caught the light from my dashboard. "Lost?" he asked, his voice raspy like he'd been smoking for decades, which, judging by the cigarette between his fingers, he probably had. I explained about missing my exit and how my GPS had died right when I needed it most. Asked if he knew how to get back to the main highway from here. He scratched his stubble and looked down the street ahead of us, then back the way I'd come, taking his time like he was doing complex math in his head. "Yeah, I know these streets like the back of my hand," he said, flicking his cigarette into the gutter where it landed in a small shower of orange sparks. "Been working this area for 15 years, doing night maintenance on the equipment they left behind when the factories closed. Your best bet is actually forward, not back. If you try to reverse course now, you'll hit all the one-way streets they put in for the morning delivery trucks." He gestured toward my van with a hand that had 2 fingers wrapped in dirty medical tape. "Tell you what, it's complicated to explain, but I can show you. My shift just ended anyway, and I live right near where you need to go." Before I could really think it through, before I could weigh the pros and cons like Jessica always said I should do more often, He was already walking around to the passenger side. The door handle clicked and suddenly he was settling into the seat next to me, bringing with him the smell of machine oil and stale tobacco. "Name's Carl," he said, buckling his seatbelt with those taped-up fingers like this was the most normal thing in the world. "Just head straight for now. I'll tell you when to turn." My gut did this little twist. Not quite fear, but definitely unease. The kind of feeling you get when you realize you've made a decision you can't easily take back. But what was I going to do? Tell him to get out? The guy was just trying to help, and I really did need directions. I put the van in drive and started forward, noticing in my peripheral vision how he was looking around the interior of the van, taking in all the packages in the back, the delivery scanner in its holster, my phone mounted on the dashboard still showing that useless searching for signal message. We drove for about 3 minutes in relative silence, just the sound of the engine and the occasional direction from Carl. "Left here," he'd say, or "keep straight through this intersection." The streets got progressively narrower, and I noticed we hadn't passed a single working streetlight in the last minute. The buildings seemed to press in closer, old loading bays and service entrances creating dark recesses where anything could be hiding. Then Carl said something that made my chest tighten. "You know, most drivers don't come through here anymore. Not since that thing with the other delivery guy a few months back." He let that hang in the air while directing me to take another right turn. "What thing?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual even though warning bells were going off in my head. Carl chuckled, this low sound that didn't contain any actual humor. "Oh, nothing proven. Guy just disappeared one night, found his van 2 weeks later parked in one of these old lots. Still had all the packages in it, nothing stolen, just no driver." He pointed ahead to a fork in the road I hadn't noticed. "Bear left here, trust me." The word trust coming out of his mouth felt wrong somehow, like when someone says honestly right before they lie to you. Every turn we made seemed to take us deeper into this maze of abandoned buildings and dead-end service roads. When I glanced at the clock on the dashboard, it showed 11:47, and I realized we'd been driving for almost 10 minutes but hadn't seen a single sign pointing toward the highway. "Hey Carl," I started, trying to keep any accusation out of my voice. "Shouldn't we have hit a main road by now?" He shifted in his seat, the vinyl creaking under his weight, and I caught him looking at the lock button on his door. "These old industrial routes are tricky," he said, but there was something different in his tone now, less helpful stranger and more like someone working hard to sound convincing. "Just a little further. Take this next right." But when I looked where he was pointing, all I saw was an alley barely wide enough for the van, with walls so close on either side that I wouldn't be able to open my door if I needed to get out quickly. I stopped the van right there, didn't even pull to the side, just hit the brakes in the middle of the empty street. "I'm not going down there," I said, surprising myself with how firm my voice came out. "This isn't the way to the highway, Carl." "Where are you really taking me?" The friendly mask he'd been wearing slipped for just a second, and I saw something else underneath, something that made every muscle in my body go tense. He recovered quickly, though, putting on this wounded expression like I'd hurt his feelings. "Hey now, I'm just trying to help here. This is the shortcut, I promise. My brother actually owns a warehouse just past this alley. We can cut straight through his lot and you'll pop out right by the on-ramp." His hand moved to his pocket, and I heard the distinctive jingle of keys. "Matter of fact, I've got the keys right here. Come on, your little girl is waiting for you, right? Didn't you say something about a bedtime story?" The fact that he remembered that detail, that he'd been paying that close attention to what I'd said earlier, sent ice through my veins. That's when I made my decision. I threw the van in reverse and started backing up fast, probably faster than was safe, but I didn't care anymore. Carl's whole demeanor changed instantly, his hand shooting out to grab the wheel. "What are you doing?" he shouted. But it wasn't a question, it was a demand. I yanked the wheel hard to the left while still in reverse, causing Carl to lose his balance and slam against the passenger door. "Get out!" I yelled, hitting the brakes again. "Get out of my van right now!" But instead of reaching for the door handle, he lunged across the center console, trying to grab the keys from the ignition. We struggled for a few seconds that felt like hours, him trying to turn off the engine while I fought to keep his hands away. His taped fingers were stronger than they looked, and I could smell his breath sour and hot as he pressed closer. Then my hand found the delivery scanner in its holster, the heavy handheld device we use to scan packages, and without thinking, I swung it as hard as I could against the side of his head. The scanner connected with a dull thud, and Carl jerked back, his hand going to his temple where a cut had opened up, blood already starting to seep between his fingers. For a moment, we just stared at each other, both breathing hard, and then he smiled. Not a normal smile, but this slow, knowing thing that made me want to hit him again. "You have no idea where you are, do you?" he said, his voice calm despite the blood now running down the side of his face. "Good luck finding your way out." Then he opened the door and stepped out into the darkness, but he didn't run or stumble. He just walked calmly back the way we'd come, whistling something tuneless that echoed off the empty buildings. I slammed my hand on the door locks the second he was out, then sat there for a moment trying to stop shaking, trying to think. My phone still had no signal. The GPS was still dead, and now I was even more lost than before. Worse, Carl knew exactly where I was, and he didn't seem worried about me getting away. I spent the next 2 hours driving through those dark streets, taking random turns, trying to find any landmark I recognized or any sign pointing toward civilization. Every shadow looked like Carl. Every distant sound made me check the mirrors. Twice I thought I saw his white panel truck in the distance, always just far enough away that I couldn't be sure. Finally, around 2 in the morning, I spotted the glow of a 24-hour gas station in the distance and practically cried with relief. When I pulled in, the attendant took one look at me and asked if I needed him to call the police. I told him I'd gotten lost and had some trouble with a stranger, kept it vague because how could I explain what had really happened? He let me use the station's landline to call Jessica, and when I heard her sleepy, worried voice asking where I was, I nearly broke down completely. The police took a report, but when I tried to describe where everything had happened, I realized I had no idea. The officer said they'd had similar reports before about that area. People getting led deeper into the industrial district by someone offering help, though nobody could ever prove anything criminal had actually happened. They never found Carl or his truck, if that was even his real name. I quit the delivery job 3 weeks later. Couldn't handle driving those late-night routes anymore. Every time I passed an industrial area or saw a white panel truck in my mirrors, my heart would start racing. Jessica understood, said she'd rather have me home safe making less money than out there wondering if I'd make it back. Sometimes I search online for news about that area, looking for other drivers with similar stories, and I found a few scattered posts on trucking forums. Always the same pattern. Helpful stranger knows the area like the back of his hand. Taped fingers leads them deeper until they barely escape. One driver mentioned finding scratches on his van later that spelled out an address, but when he looked it up, it was just an empty lot where a factory burned down in 1987. Another said he went back during daylight with some friends to retrace his route, but the streets didn't match up with what he remembered, like the whole layout had changed. I don't know what Carl wanted that night, whether it was the van, the packages, or something worse. All I know is that when Lily asks me to check her closet for monsters now, I do it thoroughly, because I learned that sometimes the real monsters are just men who smile at you while leading you exactly where you don't want to go. The divorce papers had been signed for about 2 months when Kevin called me out of the blue on a Wednesday afternoon in late September. 27 years old and already divorced. That wasn't exactly how I'd pictured my life going, but there I was, living in a studio apartment that smelled like the previous tenant's cats, eating takeout straight from the container most nights. Kevin and I had been roommates at State University for 3 years, and hearing his voice after nearly 5 years of sporadic Facebook likes and birthday texts caught me completely off guard. He said he'd heard about me and Melissa splitting up through mutual friends, and he wanted to help me get my mind off things with a weekend at his family's cabin up north. The way he described it, fishing, beer, catching up like old times, Sounded exactly like what I needed to pull myself out of the rut I'd been drowning in since moving out of the house Melissa and I had shared. The drive up that Friday took me through stretches of pine forest that got thicker the further I went from the city, following Kevin's handwritten directions because GPS stopped working about 40 miles back. The cabin sat at the end of a dirt road that my sedan barely managed, surrounded by trees so dense you couldn't see more than 20 feet in any direction. Kevin met me at the door wearing the same crooked grin he'd had in college, though his hairline had retreated considerably, and he'd put on maybe 30 pounds. He grabbed my bag before I could protest and gave me the tour. 2 bedrooms upstairs, a living area with a stone fireplace, a kitchen that looked recently renovated with expensive appliances that seemed out of place in such a rustic setting. The basement door stood at the end of the hallway, painted white but with scratches near the handle like someone had tried picking the lock. Kevin noticed me looking at it and quickly steered me toward the back deck, mentioning something about his dad keeping hunting equipment down there. Nothing interesting, just old gear and spider webs. That first evening started off exactly how I'd hoped. We grilled steaks on the deck while polishing off a 12-pack of the cheap beer we used to drink in college, swapping stories about old professors, and that time we almost got expelled for the prank with the dean's golf cart. But every 20 minutes or so, Kevin would pull out his phone, squinting at the screen in that way people do when they're trying to be subtle about checking messages. Each time, his jaw would tighten just a little before he'd slip it back in his pocket and launch into another story, usually louder than before, like he was trying to distract both of us from whatever he'd just read. Around 10 that night, after we'd moved inside and started on the whiskey, I asked him about work. He'd mentioned something about consulting when he called, but he got weirdly vague, saying he was between projects, doing some freelance stuff, nothing worth talking about. The conversation died after that, and he suggested we call it a night since he had something planned for Saturday morning. The guest bedroom upstairs had that musty smell places get when they're not used often, with a window that faced the woods and a radiator that clanged every few minutes like someone was hitting it with a wrench. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up needing the bathroom and heard Kevin talking downstairs, his voice low but urgent, saying something about tomorrow night and everything needs to be ready. Through the thin floorboards, I could make out him pacing back and forth in the living room, the old wood creaking under his weight in a rhythm that went on for at least 10 minutes. When I finally got up to use the bathroom, I tried to move quietly, but the hallway floor groaned under my feet, and Kevin's voice immediately stopped. By the time I made it back to bed, the house had gone completely silent except for that damned radiator, but I could have sworn I heard a car engine starting up somewhere in the distance, which made no sense since the nearest neighbor was supposedly miles away. Saturday morning, Kevin was already up making breakfast when I came downstairs, scrambling eggs and frying bacon like nothing weird had happened the night before. He'd set out orange juice in a pitcher I remembered from our college apartment, the one with the chip on the handle from when we'd both tried to catch it after knocking it off the counter. But his eyes had dark circles underneath them, and his smile seemed forced, like he was playing a character in a play he hadn't properly rehearsed. When I mentioned hearing voices last night, he laughed it off, said he'd been on the phone with his girlfriend who was having drama with her roommate. Nothing serious. Sorry if it woke me up. The thing is, Kevin had told me he was single when he called to invite me up here, specifically mentioned how we were both bachelor refugees now. Before I could bring this up, he was already ushering me outside, saying we should take advantage of the good weather and hike to the lake about a mile through the woods. The trail to the lake was barely visible, more like a deer path that Kevin seemed to know by memory, pointing out markers I couldn't distinguish. A bent tree here, a weird-shaped rock there, like he'd walked this route 100 times before. About halfway there, we passed another cabin, smaller and more run down than Kevin's, with boarded-up windows and a blue tarp over part of the roof. Kevin picked up his pace when we got near it, but I noticed fresh tire tracks in the mud leading to it, and what looked like smoke residue coming from the chimney. When I pointed this out, Kevin just shrugged and said, "Hunters sometimes used abandoned places illegally, especially during off-season. Better not to get involved." The lake itself was beautiful, surrounded by pine trees and perfectly still water that reflected the clouds like a mirror. But Kevin kept checking his phone even out there, fumbling with it when he thought I wasn't looking. And at one point, I saw him typing what looked like numbers, times maybe, into his notes app. We got back to the cabin around 4 in the afternoon, and Kevin immediately went to check on dinner, which seemed weird since it was way too early to start cooking. Through the kitchen window, I watched him walk around the side of the house to where his truck was parked, and he pulled out a black duffel bag from the bed that definitely hadn't been there when I arrived. He struggled with its weight, needing both hands to carry it, and instead of bringing it through the front door like a normal person, he went around back. I heard the storm cellar doors slam shut. The outside entrance to the basement I hadn't even noticed before. When he came back inside 15 minutes later, he was sweating despite the cool September air, and there was dirt under his fingernails that he kept trying to clean out with his pocket knife. He told me dinner would be ready at 8 sharp, that he'd invited a couple friends from the area to join us, guys who wanted to meet me after hearing so much about our college days. The 2 men who showed up just before 8 looked nothing like the kind of friends Kevin would have had. The first one, who introduced himself as Doug, stood about 6'4" with arms thick as fence posts and a neck tattoo of something written in what looked like Russian or Ukrainian. The other guy, Rodrigo, was shorter but moved with this careful precision, like every gesture was calculated, and he had these pale gray eyes that never seemed to blink when he looked at you. They both shook my hand too hard and too long, studying my face like they were memorizing it. Neither of them touched the food Kevin had prepared, grilled chicken and vegetables that actually looked pretty good, just nursed beers while asking me strange questions about my life. Did I travel much for work? Did I have family nearby? When was the last time I'd posted on social media? Had I told anyone where I was this weekend? That last one made my chest tighten, because I realized I hadn't. Everyone knew I was taking time to myself after the divorce, and Kevin had specifically suggested I disconnect for the weekend. After about an hour of this bizarre dinner party, Doug stood up and announced they should get started, which made Kevin go rigid in his chair. Rodrigo pulled out his phone and showed Kevin something on the screen that made all the color drain from his face. Kevin started stammering about needing more time, that this wasn't what they'd agreed on. But Doug just put a massive hand on his shoulder and squeezed until Kevin winced. That's when Rodrigo turned to me with this matter-of-fact tone and explained that Kevin owed them $78,000 from a gambling debt that had been accumulating interest for the past 18 months. The cabin, Rodrigo continued, wasn't actually Kevin's family place. He'd been renting it through a fake ID for situations like this. They needed someone with clean credit and no criminal record to drive a car across the Canadian border on Sunday night. A car that would have a hidden compartment built into the floor. The black duffel bag Kevin had brought in earlier contained the tools they'd used to create the compartment, and I'd been chosen because recently divorced men trying to start over were perfect candidates, desperate for connection, distracted by their own problems, and unlikely to be missed immediately if things went wrong. Kevin wouldn't look at me while Rodrigo laid out their plan, just stared at his plate, pushing the untouched chicken around with his fork. They expected me to drive a modified SUV from here to a location outside Montreal, where someone would meet me at a rest stop to retrieve what was hidden in the compartment. They never said what it was, but the way Doug kept mentioning how Border Patrol rarely checked law-abiding citizens with steady employment histories told me enough. If I refused, Doug explained while cracking his knuckles one by one, they had photos they'd taken of me arriving at the cabin, my car's license plate, and they knew where I worked, where my ex-wife lived, where my parents had retired to in Florida. But if I cooperated, Kevin's debt would be cleared. I'd get $10,000 in cash for 2 hours of driving, and everyone would pretend this weekend never happened. The smart thing, Rodrigo added while sliding a car key across the table toward me, would be to think of this as helping an old friend who'd made some mistakes, because the alternative, and here Doug smiled for the first time all night, revealing a gold tooth where his left canine should be, would be messier for everyone involved. I picked up the key, feeling its weight in my palm, and told them I needed to use the bathroom to think it over. Doug started to protest, but Rodrigo held up a hand, saying I had 5 minutes to accept the reality of my situation. The bathroom window was small but not impossible. I'd climbed through tighter spaces in college, and it opened onto the roof of the back porch. My car keys were in my jacket pocket, and if I could make it to my sedan, I might have a chance. But as I stood on the toilet seat pushing the window frame up, I heard Doug's voice directly below, telling someone on the phone to watch the road, that I might try to run. That's when I remembered the abandoned cabin we'd passed on the trail, the one with fresh tire tracks. They had someone stationed there too, probably had since before I even arrived. The whole weekend had been choreographed down to the minute, and Kevin's nervous phone checking suddenly made sense. He'd been getting updates on their timeline, making sure everything stayed on schedule. I came back to the dining room and set the key on the table, then did something they didn't expect. I pulled out my phone and started recording video, narrating everything that had just happened. Their names, Kevin's debt, the smuggling plan, speaking loud and clear while backing toward the door. Doug lunged forward, but I'd already hit share, uploading it to my cloud storage with a caption about my location, and that if anything happened to me, this was why. The beauty of modern technology is that even in places with terrible cell service, videos will eventually upload once they find a signal, and I made sure they understood that deleting it from my phone wouldn't matter. Rodrigo's gray eyes narrowed as he processed this. Then he looked at Kevin with such disgust that Kevin actually flinched. They left within 20 minutes, Doug shoving Kevin hard enough that he fell against the wall. Rodrigo warning me that I'd made a serious enemy, but acknowledging I'd played it smart. I spent the rest of that night in my locked car with the engine running, driving out at first light and heading straight to the police station in the nearest town. Kevin disappeared completely. His social media went dark. His phone number became disconnected. And when I looked up the cabin's address later, the rental listing had vanished. The police said without evidence of an actual crime being committed, there wasn't much they could do, but they'd keep the report on file. Sometimes I still get unknown calls that I don't answer, and I changed apartments twice in the 6 months after that weekend, but nothing ever came of it. I never found out what was supposed to be in that compartment, and honestly, I don't want to know. My boyfriend Nathan had been gone for maybe 2 hours when everything went sideways that Saturday in August. We'd been living together in Denver since June, sharing this apartment near Washington Park, where you could hear the trains at night and smell bread from the bakery downstairs every morning. Nathan handled logistics for a medical supply company. Basically meant he drove all over Colorado, checking warehouses and dealing with shipping problems. And that morning, Phoenix called about some emergency with their inventory system. Before he left, practically running out the door with his coffee still on the counter, he asked me to do him this favor: pick up a package from his friend Tom's house in Aurora. Said they'd been negotiating about these vintage baseball cards for months, already paid for, just needed someone to grab them. The address he texted me led to this neighborhood 40 minutes away where the GPS kept losing signal, and the street names didn't follow any pattern I could figure out. Tom's house sat at the end of Sycamore Court like it was hiding from the rest of the world, surrounded by these massive cottonwood trees that blocked most of the sunlight, even at noon. The whole street felt abandoned, newspapers yellowing in driveways, lawns growing wild with dandelions and crabgrass, mailboxes stuffed so full the doors wouldn't close. His place stood out because everything was too neat, too deliberate. Perfectly trimmed hedges in perfect squares, a driveway without a single oil stain, and these wind chimes hanging from the porch ceiling that must have cost a fortune. Crystal and copper and some kind of black metal I couldn't identify. When I rang the doorbell, I heard movement inside right away, but nobody came to the door for several minutes. Just footsteps going back and forth, cabinets slamming, what sounded like books being moved around, until finally the locks turned. 3 of them, one after another. And this man appeared wearing clothes that belonged at a business meeting, not a Saturday afternoon. Tom looked nothing like what Nathan had described. Instead of the beer belly contractor type I expected, Here stood this thin guy, maybe mid-40s, with shoulders that curved forward like he spent his whole life hunched over something small and detailed. His hair was this unusual bronze color, definitely dyed but done professionally, slicked back with so much product it looked wet, and he had these pale gray eyes that never seemed to blink at the normal rate. The handshake he offered felt wrong somehow, his palm completely dry but cold, like he'd been holding ice cubes, and he held on for maybe 2 seconds longer than comfortable, studying my face like he was memorizing it. He said Nathan had told him all about me, which was weird because Nathan barely mentioned Tom except for the baseball card thing, and then he insisted I come inside while he got the package ready, said it would just take a minute to wrap it properly. The inside of his house made even less sense than the outside. Every wall painted this flat beige that seemed to absorb light instead of reflecting it. No photos anywhere, no decorations except for these identical bronze sculptures on every surface that looked like twisted wire, formed into shapes that hurt to stare at too long. The living room had plastic covers on all the furniture like my grandmother used to have, but the plastic looked brand new, still had creases from the packaging, and underneath I could see dark green couches that probably cost more than my car. Tom disappeared down a hallway, telling me to make myself comfortable, and I heard him on the phone with someone, speaking too quietly to make out the words, but the tone sounded urgent, almost angry, lots of short, clipped sentences that ended with these long pauses. About 10 minutes passed before Tom came back, carrying not a package but a silver tray with coffee and these small sandwiches cut into perfect triangles, the crusts removed like something from a fancy hotel. He set it down on the coffee table, which made this hollow sound like it was completely empty inside, and told me the package was still being prepared upstairs. His business partner was wrapping it specially since the cards were so valuable. The coffee tasted strange. Not bad exactly, but like it had something else mixed in. Maybe hazelnut or vanilla, but not quite either. And Tom watched me drink it with this intensity that made me take smaller sips than normal. He started asking questions about Nathan and me, how we met, where I worked, if my family lived nearby, did anybody know I was here today. That last one made me put the cup down because who asks something like that when you're just picking up baseball cards? The air in the room started feeling thicker, heavier, like before a storm but inside the house, and I noticed Tom had positioned himself between me and the front door without making it obvious, just casually standing there while he talked about how Nathan was smart to send me instead of coming himself. He said Nathan understood the situation perfectly, which made no sense because what situation could there be with baseball cards? And then he pulled out his phone to show me something. Except what appeared on the screen wasn't cards, but photos of documents, shipping manifests with highlighted sections, customs forms with Nathan's signature at the bottom. My phone buzzed in my pocket, Nathan calling, but when I reached for it, Tom shook his head slowly and said we needed to discuss what I was really here to pick up, because apparently Nathan hadn't been honest with either of us, and now I was what he called a liability in motion, whatever that meant. Tom walked to the window and pulled the curtains closed, even though it was barely 2 in the afternoon, the room dropping into this yellowish darkness from a single lamp with a shade that looked like human skin, all translucent and veined. He explained that Nathan's job wasn't just logistics. He'd been moving packages through the medical supply chain that contained things that weren't medical supplies, using his legitimate routes to hide shipments of pills that came from somewhere outside the country. The documents on his phone showed Nathan's signature on forms for containers that supposedly held syringes and gauze, but actually contained thousands of unmarked tablets, the kind that people were dying from all over Colorado. Tom said he used to handle the financial side until he realized Nathan was skimming, taking product for himself or selling it to other buyers, and now there were people asking questions, dangerous people who didn't accept excuses or believe in coincidences. My phone kept buzzing and Tom finally let me answer it, but he stayed close enough that I could smell his cologne, something medicinal and sharp like rubbing alcohol mixed with pine. Nathan's voice came through immediately, asking if I'd gotten the package yet, telling me to leave right now, don't drink anything Tom offered, just get out and drive home. but Tom grabbed the phone and put it on speaker so we could all hear. The two of them started arguing, Nathan insisting Tom was lying about everything, that he was paranoid and delusional from sampling his own product, while Tom kept repeating these numbers, dates, amounts, shipment codes, that made Nathan go quiet. Then Nathan said something that made my whole body go rigid. He told Tom that if anything happened to me, he'd already arranged for certain information to reach the authorities, that I was his insurance policy, which apparently was news to both Tom and me. Tom's face changed completely when he heard that, his polite mask slipping to show something underneath that reminded me of those nature documentaries where the snake goes perfectly still right before it strikes. He walked to the front door and turned the deadbolt, then another lock I hadn't noticed before, one that required a key from both sides, and he slipped that key into his shirt pocket while maintaining eye contact with me the whole time. On the phone, Nathan started yelling, saying he was calling the police, but Tom just laughed, this quiet, breathy sound that was somehow worse than screaming, and said Nathan wouldn't do that unless he wanted to explain the $300,000 in cash hidden in our apartment, money that apparently came from the sales Nathan had been making on the side. I didn't know about any money, had never seen anything like that in our place, but the silence on Nathan's end told me Tom wasn't lying about this part. The room felt smaller suddenly, like the walls had moved in while we were talking, and I realized my arms and legs felt heavy, sluggish, like trying to move through water. Tom noticed me swaying and guided me to the couch, his grip on my elbow firm but not rough, almost gentle, like a nurse helping a patient, and he explained that the coffee just had a mild sedative, nothing dangerous, just something to keep everyone calm while we sorted this out. Nathan was screaming through the phone now, threatening Tom with names of people I'd never heard, saying they were already on their way, but Tom picked up my phone and hung up, then removed the battery and SIM card with practiced efficiency. He sat across from me in this antique chair that creaked under his weight and pulled out a second phone, started scrolling through messages, showing me conversations between Nathan and buyers, photos of our apartment building, even a picture of me walking to my car from 2 weeks ago that someone had sent to Nathan as what Tom called leverage verification. Tom explained that I had exactly two choices. I could take a package back to Nathan, not baseball cards, but a GPS tracker hidden inside what looked like a vintage card box, something that would let Tom's associates know every move Nathan made until they recovered their money. Or I could wait here until Nathan arrived to trade himself for me, which Tom said would happen within the hour based on how desperate he'd sounded. The sedative was wearing off faster than Tom expected, probably because I'd only drunk half the coffee, and I could feel my mind getting sharper even though I kept my body slack, let him think I was still foggy. That's when I noticed something Tom hadn't. A car had pulled up outside, engine still running, and through the gap in the curtains I could see someone sitting in the driver's seat just waiting. Tom's phone rang and he walked to the kitchen to answer it, speaking in Spanish this time, agitated, lots of no, and what sounded like excuses, and I realized whoever was outside wasn't with Tom. The moment Tom turned his back, I forced myself up from the couch, my legs barely cooperating but adrenaline helping, and stumbled toward the back of the house where I'd seen a sliding door earlier. Tom heard me moving and came running back, but I'd already reached the door, was fumbling with the lock when he grabbed my wrist, not violent but firm, saying I was making a mistake, that whoever was outside wasn't there to help me but to clean up Nathan's mess permanently. The car door opened outside and someone stepped out, a woman in a business suit carrying what looked like a small metal briefcase. And Tom actually looked scared for the first time, pulling me away from the door and toward the stairs, saying we needed to hide, both of us right now. But I didn't trust him any more than I trusted Nathan at that point, so when he loosened his grip to lock the sliding door, I grabbed one of those bronze sculptures and swung it at the window beside the door, shattering it completely, the sound like an explosion in the quiet house. And I squeezed through the opening, feeling glass tear my jacket, cutting my hands. But I kept going, running through his backyard toward the fence while behind me, Tom yelled something about not letting her see me. But it was too late. I was already climbing over, dropping into the neighbor's yard, their dog barking like crazy, as I ran between houses toward the street. My car was parked 3 houses down and I sprinted toward it, keys already in my hand, blood from the cuts making them slippery. And I could hear footsteps behind me, not running but walking fast, confident, like whoever it was knew I couldn't get away. The engine started on the first try and I reversed out so fast I clipped someone's trash cans, sending them rolling into the street. But I didn't stop, just threw it in drive and floored it out of that neighborhood. In the rearview mirror, I saw the woman in the suit standing in the middle of the road, not chasing, just watching me leave. And she was holding something up. My wallet, which must have fallen out during the escape, meaning she now had my driver's license, my address, everything. I drove straight to the police station downtown, my hands leaving bloody prints on the steering wheel, and walked inside looking like I'd been attacked, which got their attention immediately. The detective who interviewed me, a woman named Reeves with gray hair pulled back tight and coffee stains on her sleeve, listened to the whole story without interrupting once, just taking notes in this little spiral notebook with handwriting so small I couldn't read it upside down. When I finished, she made some calls, sent officers to Tom's address, but they found the house completely empty. Not just no people, but no furniture, no bronze sculptures, nothing except those wind chimes still tinkling on the porch. Our apartment was different, though. They found the money exactly where Tom said it would be, wrapped in plastic and hidden inside a hole cut in the back of our bedroom closet, behind a piece of drywall Nathan had apparently removed and replaced so carefully I'd never noticed. Nathan never came home that day or any day after. His phone disconnected. His car found abandoned at a rest stop near the Wyoming border with blood on the driver's seat that turned out to be his type, but not enough to mean he was dead. The DEA got involved after that, took over the case, asked me the same questions 50 different ways, but I didn't know anything useful, just that I'd been living with a stranger for 2 years and almost died because of it. The diesel engine had been humming under me for 19 hours straight when I saw those reflective markers gleaming in the darkness ahead. My frozen food delivery run should have ended 6 hours earlier, but a jackknifed semi near the state line had trapped me and dozens of other trucks in gridlock hell. By the time traffic started moving again, dispatch was screaming through the radio about penalty fees and angry restaurant owners, so stopping at a motel wasn't even an option anymore. Every joint in my body ached from sitting in that worn driver's seat, and the gas station coffee I'd been chugging had stopped working around hour 15. The truck's heater was blasting hot air straight at my face, making my eyes water and blur, turning the empty highway into a river of black asphalt and yellow lines that seemed to breathe and shift in my peripheral vision. That exit ramp appeared through my windshield like a mirage, the curve of it matching what my exhausted brain expected to see after making this run twice a week for the past 3 years. The reflective markers caught my headlights at just the right angle, and my arms moved the steering wheel before my mind could even question whether this was actually my turn. The second my tires hit that side road, though, everything felt wrong. The surface was rough and uneven, making the whole cab shake and rattle in a way that should have snapped me fully awake. But exhaustion does strange things to your judgment, makes you rationalize stuff that would normally set off every alarm bell in your head. No streetlights lined this road. No familiar landmarks appeared in my high beams, just dense walls of pine trees pressing in from both sides like they were trying to swallow the narrow strip of broken pavement. My phone had been charging in the cup holder, and when I grabbed it to check my GPS, the screen showed 0 bars, and the map app just spun endlessly trying to find a signal. The clock on the dashboard read 1:47 a.m., and I'd been driving down this dark road for at least 10 minutes already, way longer than the usual 3-minute stretch from the highway to my neighborhood. Part of me knew I should stop, turn around, get back to the interstate and find the right exit, but another part, the exhausted, stubborn part that just wanted to be home, kept pushing the accelerator. The fuel gauge showed a quarter tank left, enough to drive around lost for a while, but not enough to waste if I really had no idea where I was heading. Every shadow outside the windows looked like it could be hiding a driveway or a street sign. But when my headlights swept across them, there was nothing but more trees and occasionally a rusted guardrail that looked like it hadn't been replaced since the 70s. Then the road started getting narrower, and I mean really narrow, to the point where pine branches were scraping against the side mirrors with this horrible scratching sound that made my teeth hurt. The pavement turned to gravel, then to packed dirt with patches of ice that made the rear of the truck fishtail every few seconds. My breathing got shallow and quick because now I couldn't even attempt a three-point turn if I wanted to. The trees were too close, and the truck was too long. The only option was to keep going forward and hope for a clearing or a driveway wide enough to turn around in. That's when exhaustion hit me like a sledgehammer to the skull, my vision starting to tunnel, my head nodding forward involuntarily. I knew if I didn't stop immediately, I'd either crash into a tree or drive off into a ditch, so when I spotted a slightly wider section of road up ahead, I pulled over as far as I could and threw the truck in park. The plan was just to rest my eyes for 5 minutes, maybe 10 at most, just enough to stop seeing double and get my bearings straight. I cracked the window slightly to let cold air in, hoping it would keep me from falling too deep asleep, then leaned my seat back and closed my eyes. The last thing I remember thinking was how quiet everything was. No traffic sounds, no wind, not even birds or crickets, just this thick silence that pressed against my eardrums. When I opened my eyes again, the dashboard clock showed 4:23 a.m., which meant I'd been out cold for over 2 hours. My neck was stiff as hell, and my mouth tasted like something had died in it. But what really made my chest tighten was realizing the truck wasn't where I'd parked it. Instead of being on that narrow dirt road surrounded by pine trees, I was sitting in front of a 2-story house with peeling white paint and a wraparound porch that looked older than my grandfather. The truck was perfectly parallel, parked along what appeared to be a proper paved driveway, the kind with those neat concrete borders and everything, like someone had carefully maneuvered it into position while I slept. My keys were still in the ignition, the engine was off, and the parking brake was engaged, things I definitely didn't remember doing. But what really made every hair on my arm stand up was the porch light being on, casting this sickly yellow glow over the front door, and there was someone standing behind the screen door, just a dark silhouette that wasn't moving at all. They were just standing there, perfectly still, like they'd been waiting for me to wake up. The worst part was how my truck's headlights were still on, pointing directly at the house, which meant whoever was standing there had been watching me sleep this entire time, probably seeing my face clearly through the windshield while they remained hidden in shadow. My first instinct was to start the engine and get the hell out of there, but when I turned the key, nothing happened, not even that clicking sound you get with a dead battery. The fuel gauge still showed a quarter tank, all the dashboard lights came on normally, but the engine wouldn't even try to turn over. That's when the figure behind the screen door moved for the first time, raising one hand and pressing it flat against the mesh like they were trying to push through it. Even from 40 feet away, I could see their fingers were way too long, each one bent at weird angles like they'd been broken and healed wrong multiple times. Then they knocked, 3 slow, deliberate taps that echoed across the empty yard, and I swear the sound was louder inside the truck than it should have been, like they were knocking directly on my windshield. I grabbed my phone again, praying for even 1 bar of signal to call for help, but the screen wouldn't even turn on this time, completely dead despite being plugged into the charger for hours. The person behind the door knocked again. Same pattern, 3 measured taps, and then they spoke in this raspy voice that sounded like they'd been gargling gravel. "Delivery's late, but you're finally here." My manifest was sitting on the passenger seat, and when I glanced at it, trying to make sense of what was happening, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. An additional delivery address handwritten at the bottom in shaky blue ink that was still wet and smearing. The address matched the rusted numbers I could barely make out on a crooked mailbox at the end of the driveway, 4862 Millbrook Way. But here's the thing that really messed with my head. Millbrook Way was the street I grew up on, except my childhood home burned down 15 years ago. And this house, this exact house with the same peeling paint and busted porch railing, looked exactly like it did in the old photos my mom kept in our family albums. The figure pushed the screen door open with those grotesque fingers, and it made this horrible screech that sounded exactly like the door at my childhood home used to sound. My dad never fixed it, always said he'd get around to oiling those hinges next weekend. Now I could see more details in the porch light, stringy gray hair hanging past their shoulders, clothes that looked like they'd been buried in dirt and dug up again, and a face I couldn't quite focus on, like my eyes kept sliding off it whenever I tried to look directly at them. They stepped onto the porch, moving in this jerky, unnatural way, like someone was pulling them forward with invisible strings. 28 years, they said, and my blood turned to ice because that was my exact age. 28 years since you were supposed to make this delivery, and now you're here just like we arranged. My hand fumbled for the door handle, ready to bolt on foot if I had to, but the doors wouldn't unlock. The mechanism just clicked uselessly when I pulled on it. The interior lights started flickering, and in those brief moments of darkness, I could see more figures appearing on the porch, all of them moving with that same puppet-like jerkiness. There were maybe 6 or 7 of them, all wearing clothes from different decades like they'd each been waiting here for years. One wore a milk delivery uniform from what looked like the 1950s, another had on a postal worker outfit that was rotting at the seams, and there was even someone in a pizza delivery shirt from a chain that went out of business when I was a kid. They all stood there, swaying slightly, and then they all spoke in unison with that same gravelly voice. Every road leads here eventually, when you're tired enough to take the turn. Panic gave me strength I didn't know I had left, and I slammed my shoulder into the driver's door hard enough to pop something in my shoulder socket. The door burst open and I tumbled out onto the cold driveway, scrambling to my feet as those things started moving down the porch steps toward me. But the moment my boots hit the ground, everything changed. The house started to shimmer and fade like heat waves rising off hot asphalt. The figures dissolved into wisps of fog, and suddenly I was standing in an empty lot full of charred foundation stones and blackened timber. My truck was parked right where my old bedroom used to be, engine running smooth as silk, like nothing had ever been wrong with it. The dashboard clock showed 4:31 a.m., and when I looked at my phone, it was working perfectly with full battery and 3 bars of signal, showing my location as the vacant lot at 4862 Millbrook Way. The real one, the one that had been empty since the fire that killed the previous owners back in 1995. I got back in that truck and drove straight home without stopping, didn't even care that I was technically stealing company property by not returning to the depot first. When I checked the manifest later, that handwritten address was gone, just blank paper where it had been. I quit that job the next morning, didn't even give notice, just dropped the keys in the mail slot and never went back. The company called a few times asking about the missing hours in my delivery log and why the GPS showed my truck stationary at an address that didn't exist for over 2 hours. But I never answered. Sometimes I drive past that empty lot where my childhood home used to be, and there's nothing there but weeds and broken concrete. But once, just once, about 6 months later, I saw another delivery truck parked there at dawn. Driver slumped over the wheel, and I wanted to wake them up, warn them, but I kept driving because I knew, somehow I just knew, that whatever uses that place as bait only works when you're exhausted enough to see what isn't really there, or maybe to see what's more real than anything else. That weekend drive was supposed to be nothing more than a break before finals. We had packed the car with too much junk food, old playlists, and that careless energy you only get in your early 20s. I remember the road shimmering in the heat and the smell of gasoline mixing with sunscreen and energy drinks. There were 5 of us: me, Brandon, Emily, Paige, and Connor. We had no real destination, just a rough plan to head west until the tank told us to stop. I was behind the wheel when Paige pointed out something beyond the trees: rusted metal, faint colors, and the shape of a Ferris wheel tilting against the horizon. We pulled over near a chain-link fence half swallowed by weeds. The sign hanging from it was so sun-bleached that only the word fairground was still readable. A carousel spun lazily inside, half its bulbs dead, the rest flickering like they were fighting to stay alive. The air was heavy and still, not the kind of silence that feels calm, more like everything nearby had forgotten how to move. Brandon joked about Instagram gold, and before I could say anything, everyone was already climbing through a gap in the fence, laughing like kids sneaking into a swimming pool after hours. The ground inside was soft with old popcorn and leaves. Booths stood like hollow ribs along the main walkway, paint peeling off in sheets, prizes still hanging from hooks, their eyes faded to ghostly dots. The carousel kept turning, slow and uneven, making a sound that reminded me of a breath drawn through teeth. Emily said it must be running on leftover power from the nearby substation, but I could tell she was only guessing. There was something uneasy about how that thing turned, steady, deliberate, as if it was waiting for someone. By the time the sun started to dip, the air had cooled, and our excitement began to fade into quiet. Connor had wandered toward the Ferris wheel, Brandon was filming the carousel with his phone, and Paige was calling out for them to pose for pictures. I hung back near the entrance, feeling the fence rattle behind me every now and then, though no wind was blowing. I remember thinking I heard a faint tune, a melody that seemed to hum through the fairground, distant but persistent, like an old carnival song played underwater. Brandon was the first to disappear. We were gathered near a row of game stalls when Emily asked where he went. His phone light had been visible a moment earlier, bouncing around the carousel's mirrors. Then it just vanished. We called out his name a few times, laughing at first, assuming he was trying to mess with us. But when Paige walked over to where he had been, she found his backpack lying on the ground, one strap torn like it had caught on something sharp. No sign of him anywhere. Connor suggested he might have gone to the Ferris wheel again, though that was in the opposite direction. We split up, Paige and I heading toward the rides while Emily checked the ticket booth. The deeper we went, the more the fairground seemed to change. The air felt thick, and the lights flickered slower, like each bulb was running out of breath. Somewhere behind the carousel, I heard the faint creak of metal, followed by what sounded like laughter, but not Brandon's. It was higher, thinner, and carried an echo that did not fade naturally. When we regrouped near the entrance, Emily wasn't with us. Paige was calling her name again and again, her voice cracking a little more each time. Connor climbed onto a bench to get a better look around, shining his flashlight in wide arcs. The beam caught on something by the carousel, a smear of red across one of the painted horses. The strange part was that the horse's head had shifted since we last saw it, tilted slightly toward us as if listening. Connor swore it had been facing the other way earlier. We ran to the fence, but the gap we had crawled through was gone. The wire had been twisted back into place, rusted edges overlapping like it had always been sealed. My phone showed no signal, and every direction past the fairground faded into blackness that the flashlights could not cut through. Paige was crying. Connor kept shouting for Emily and Brandon, and all I could hear beneath it was that same distant melody, louder now, circling around us in uneven bursts. Connor said he saw movement near the Ferris wheel, so we went that way, staying close together. The closer we got, the more the ground seemed to tilt slightly, like the earth itself was uneven under the rides. The Ferris wheel stood still now, but its cabins swayed as though someone invisible was stepping inside each one. Paige whispered that she heard a voice calling her name from one of the cars. Before I could stop her, she ran ahead, disappearing behind a row of tents. I shouted and followed, only to find her phone lying in the dirt, screen cracked, camera still recording the empty space in front of it. Connor grabbed my arm and told me we had to leave, find another way out. We followed the sound of running water, thinking there might be a drainage ditch along the back fence. The air smelled of rust and wet soil. When we reached the edge, we found a small service gate hanging crooked on its hinges. Beyond it was nothing but dark highway, silent and endless. Connor pushed the gate and it opened without resistance. I turned around for one last glance at the fairground, and the lights had all gone out, every single one. Only the carousel remained, still turning in perfect circles, though I could not hear the motor anymore. We made it back to the car somehow. Neither of us said a word on the drive home. Connor stared straight ahead the entire time, his knuckles pale against the steering wheel. When we stopped at a gas station miles later, he ran inside to use the bathroom and never came back. I searched the aisles, the lot, even asked the cashier if anyone else had come through. No one had. His wallet was still on the passenger seat when I got back to the car. I left it there and drove until morning, unsure if the road was even leading anywhere real anymore. It has been years since that night. I tried reporting what happened, but the local sheriff claimed the fairground had been demolished decades ago after an accident killed several workers. When I showed him the photos still on my phone, he looked at me like I was lying. Most of them were blank, except one. It shows the carousel perfectly lit and 5 people standing beside it. Only 2 of us have faces. I remember that night with a kind of clarity that feels unfair. Every sound, every color, even the way the air smelled when I stepped out of the bar. It's all still there. I had been laughing louder than usual, trying to seem more relaxed than I really was. It was late, and most of the office crew had already called their rides or booked a car. When I noticed Michael still sitting at the bar, scrolling through his phone, I told him I could take him home. He hesitated just for a second, but I brushed it off with that same stupid confidence people mistake for control. I told everyone I was fine, that I hadn't had much to drink. Michael wasn't just a coworker. He was the kind of person who remembered everyone's coffee order, who stayed late to help when no one asked. We had shared shifts, lunch breaks, and quiet complaints about management. That night he had looked tired, like someone who wanted the week to end already. I think that's why I insisted. Maybe a part of me wanted to feel useful, like I could do something decent for once. I remember the faint hum of the neon sign outside the bar flickering red on his glasses as he finally said, "All right, if you're sure." We took the long way home, not because it was faster, but because someone had mentioned police checkpoints near the main road. I laughed it off, saying it was safer to take the back roads anyway. The truth was, I didn't want to risk it. Pride. That's all it was. The kind of pride that makes you smile when someone questions your judgment, when deep down you know you shouldn't even be holding the keys. The first few miles were quiet. Trees on both sides, the sound of tires against gravel, and Michael talking softly about a podcast he had been listening to. I can't even remember the name of it now. Then came the curve. It's strange how a single stretch of road can live inside your head forever. Wasn't sharp, not even dangerous in daylight. But that night the air was damp, the asphalt dark and slick. I remember the headlights catching something reflective, maybe a road sign, maybe a puddle, and for a second my hands tightened on the wheel. The car drifted, just a little, enough for me to overcorrect. The sound of the tires losing grip was followed by silence so sudden it didn't make sense. Then the world folded in on itself. Metal, glass, and something I can never unhear. When I opened my eyes, everything was wrong. The windshield was gone, the radio was still playing, and the smell of burnt rubber mixed with something metallic that made me want to be sick. The world outside looked tilted, like the trees were leaning in to stare. My seatbelt had locked so hard that it felt like my ribs had been clamped. Michael was quiet beside me, his head turned slightly as if he had just fallen asleep. I called his name once, then again, but the sound came out like a whisper I didn't recognize as my own. There was no response, not even the smallest movement. People talk about adrenaline, how it keeps you from feeling pain, but that night, it felt more like I had been separated from myself entirely. I remember stumbling out of the car, barefoot, the gravel cutting into my feet, and just standing there. The road stretched behind us, empty and black. The only light came from one of the car's headlights, still glowing weakly through the steam rising from the hood. I kept expecting to see another car come by, someone who could help, but no one did. It was like that road had disappeared from the map just for us. When the first responder arrived, a local deputy, I think, I was sitting in the grass, hugging my knees. He asked me questions I couldn't answer. "How fast were you going? Did you have anything to drink tonight?" I remember shaking my head automatically, even though we both knew the truth was sitting heavy in the air between us. They covered Michael with a blanket that looked too clean, too white for that place. The sound of the zipper when they put him in the body bag didn't belong in the world. It shouldn't have existed. The next days blurred together like a punishment. Hospital lights, paperwork, the smell of antiseptic that clung to everything. My parents showed up, their faces caught between anger and worry. But I couldn't look at them for long. When the officer came to tell me about the charge, vehicular manslaughter, I didn't even react. I remember staring at his badge and thinking how polished it looked, how it reflected the ceiling light in this neat little circle. I had killed someone, and I was noticing reflections. That realization hit harder than any word they said afterward. Court hearings became a rhythm I couldn't escape. Every appearance felt the same. The hum of fluorescent lights, the shuffle of papers, the quiet coughs echoing through the room. I avoided Michael's family every time they were there. His mother once glanced in my direction, and I looked away so fast it hurt my neck. There are no words that can fix something like that. The prosecution didn't need to exaggerate anything. My own choices were evidence enough. When the judge read the sentence, community service, license revoked, probation, I knew I had gotten a mercy I didn't deserve. Life after the trial felt quieter in the wrong ways. Friends stopped calling. Co-workers avoided eye contact when I returned to the office. The empty chair where Michael used to sit was replaced within a week, but I couldn't forget how his coffee mug had a small chip near the handle. It was ridiculous, the things that stuck. I sold my car, moved to a smaller apartment, and started taking the bus. Every time I heard tires screech, even from blocks away, my body reacted before my mind could tell me it was nothing. Nights were the worst. Dreams that ended in that same curve, that same sound of metal folding in on itself. Therapy helped in pieces. My counselor said I needed to forgive myself eventually, but I don't think forgiveness works like that. It isn't something you earn by being sorry enough or by surviving long enough. Some mornings, I drive to the memorial Michael's family built by the road. A small wooden cross, flowers that change with the seasons, and sometimes a photo that fades in the sun. I sit there in silence until the air grows heavy. The world keeps moving, but that stretch of road never does. It feels stuck in the same second, waiting for something that already happened. I do not drink anymore. I do not drive either, not even short distances. People tell me I should try again, that it has been years, but I cannot. Every decision since that night has been about preventing another one like it. Maybe that is what living with guilt really means. Not a single haunting moment, but a constant negotiation with yourself to never forget why it happened. I do not expect peace, and maybe I do not deserve it. But I still visit that road, and sometimes, when I stand there long enough, I whisper his name, just to remind the world that he mattered. It had been a long weekend, the kind that drains you in a good way, a mix of bad coffee, gas station snacks, and hours of pointless conversations. My friend Ryan and I were heading back to campus after spending 2 days in the mountains. It was close to midnight when we decided to take a detour. Ryan claimed it would shave off almost an hour if we cut through an old rural road that barely appeared on the GPS. I remember hesitating, watching the black stretch of road vanish into the trees, but we were tired and wanted to get home before dawn. That road felt different from the rest. There were no houses, no street lights, not even the hum of other cars. Just the sound of gravel under the tires and the steady rhythm of the wipers scraping against a thin drizzle. The dashboard light painted Ryan's face in a strange green hue, making him look older, worn out. He kept glancing at the fuel gauge, muttering that we'd make it fine. I tried to joke about horror movies starting this way, but even my laugh sounded forced. The air got colder as we climbed a gentle slope. My phone had lost signal miles ago, and the only light came from the headlights cutting through the mist. I noticed a shape on the side of the road. Small, moving, hard to make out. Before I could say anything, Ryan hit the brakes. The thud that followed didn't sound like an animal. It was heavy, final, followed by a dull scrape beneath the bumper. For a second, neither of us spoke. The silence after the impact was worse than the sound itself. Ryan jumped out first. I stayed inside, gripping the seatbelt, trying to convince myself we had hit a deer. He shouted something I couldn't hear, so I stepped out. The smell of wet asphalt and iron filled the air. I saw the shape, pale, motionless, lying twisted near the ditch. It looked like a man, not an animal. His legs were bent wrong and there was a torn jacket half soaked in mud. My brain refused to accept it. Ryan kept repeating that we couldn't stay, that no one would believe us if we called the police from an isolated road at midnight. We dragged the body off the road without saying a word. My hands were numb, but not from the cold. I remember the weight of his arm as it slipped from my grip, the sound of his jacket brushing against the gravel. Ryan kept whispering that it was the only way, that if anyone drove by and saw us, it would look worse than it was. We pushed him into the ditch and I caught a glimpse of his face, half covered in mud, one eye open. It didn't look like a person anymore, just something broken and empty. I forced myself to look away. The drive after that felt endless. Neither of us spoke. The rain got heavier, washing away the blood that had splattered on the hood. Every time the wipers moved, I saw flashes of that face in the streaked glass. Ryan's jaw was clenched so tight it looked painful. He said he would take the car to a friend's garage the next morning, get the bumper fixed, and no one would ever know. I wanted to believe him, but I could still smell the metallic air every time I breathed in. Sleep that night felt impossible. 2 days later, the sound of knocking woke me up before sunrise. When I looked out my window, there was a police cruiser parked by the curb. My chest tightened as I watched 2 officers walk toward Ryan's house across the street. We had grown up in the same neighborhood, just a few houses apart. They talked to him for a while, then one of them pointed toward my place. Moments later, there was a knock on my own door. The officer said they were investigating a hit and run on that same road we had taken. A man had been found dead in a ditch. The words barely made sense as he spoke them. He said the man had survived a motorcycle crash and was trying to crawl for help when we hit him. The security camera at a small gas station had caught our car passing through minutes before the incident. They wanted both of us to come down to the station for questioning. Ryan looked like a ghost when we saw each other there. He kept rubbing his temples, muttering that it was an accident. The detective didn't say much, but his expression said everything. He knew we had seen that it was a man. Ryan was charged first. His fingerprints were found on the hood, and the paint samples matched the traces from the victim's clothes. When they questioned me, I told them the truth, at least most of it. I said we thought it was an animal, that everything happened too fast. They wrote it all down without looking up. When the interview ended, the officer said something that stuck with me. Panic doesn't erase responsibility. Those words played over and over in my head for days afterward, louder than any siren could have been. The media got hold of the story soon after. Headlines called it a tragic accident, but online, people had their own version. 2 careless students who ran from what they'd done. My phone filled with messages from classmates pretending to check in just to get details. Ryan stopped answering my calls. His parents moved him out of the dorms before the semester ended. I kept going to class, pretending to focus, but every time a car passed too close, I flinched. Every night, I heard the sound of that impact in my dreams. Months went by and the case faded from the news. Ryan's lawyer managed to negotiate a plea deal. I was classified as a witness, not an accomplice, but it did not feel like I deserved the distance that label gave me. I avoided that road whenever I drove home. One evening, I took the long route through the city, and still, at one stoplight, I saw a man on the shoulder, limping under the flickering yellow light. It was just a stranger, probably someone fixing his car, but I could not breathe until the light turned green. Even now, years later, I still think about that night. I sometimes wonder if the man we hit had seen our headlights coming, if he raised his hand, hoping we would stop. I never asked the police for details. I did not want to know his name or the town he was from. It feels wrong to attach a full story to someone whose ending I helped write. The truth is, The silence afterward was not just fear, it was shame, the kind that lingers long after punishment ends. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Turning 27 felt like some kind of checkpoint I was not ready for, and my co-workers at the dental office where I worked as a hygienist threw me a small party in the break room that March of 2024. I had been single for almost 2 years at that point, not really looking but not opposed to meeting someone either. My life in Raleigh, North Carolina revolved around work, my 2 cats, and the occasional weekend trip to visit my mom a couple hours away. I lived in a ground floor apartment in a quiet complex near a strip mall, the kind of place where neighbors nodded politely but rarely spoke. One of the other hygienists, a woman named Faye who had become something like a best friend over the years, convinced me to download a dating app during our lunch break. She sat there watching me swipe through profiles, laughing at the bad ones, pointing out the ones she thought had potential. That afternoon I matched with a guy named Trevor Ashby, and Faye practically cheered when she saw his photos. He had kind eyes, a decent smile, and his bio mentioned he loved cooking and rescue dogs. We went on 4 dates over the next 3 weeks, and he was pleasant enough. Coffee near a bookstore, a walk through a park downtown, dinner at an Italian place he picked, and one night at his apartment where he cooked me pasta and we talked for hours. Trevor worked as some kind of database administrator, lived alone in a rented house about 20 minutes from my complex, and seemed genuinely interested in everything I had to say. He remembered that I preferred iced coffee even when it was cold outside, that my older cat was named Benson, that I had a complicated relationship with my father. But something about him made me uneasy in a way I could not quite name. He texted constantly, sometimes sending 4 or 5 messages before I could respond to the first one. He asked detailed questions about my schedule, my routine, where I shopped for groceries. After that 4th date, I knew I needed to end things before they went any further. I sent him a text on a Sunday afternoon, thanking him for the time we spent together but explaining I did not feel a romantic connection. His reply came almost instantly, just a single word: okay. No argument, no pushback, nothing. I thought I had handled it well. I thought he understood. The first sign that something was wrong came about 2 weeks later. I was grabbing lunch at a sandwich shop I went to almost every Friday, a little place in a plaza near my office, when I spotted Trevor sitting at a corner table. He was just staring at me, not eating, not looking at his phone, just watching. When our eyes met, he smiled and gave me a small wave like we were old friends running into each other by coincidence. I waved back awkwardly, grabbed my order, and left as fast as I could without making it obvious I was rushing. I told myself it was nothing, that Raleigh was not that big and people crossed paths sometimes. But then it happened again 3 days later at the grocery store I always went to on Monday evenings. He was standing at the end of an aisle, pretending to look at cereal boxes, but I could feel his eyes following me as I moved through the store. I abandoned my cart and drove home with my heart pounding in my chest. That night I double-checked every lock on my doors and windows before I could even think about sleeping. Faye was the first person I told, and she took it seriously right away. She asked if I had kept any of his messages, if I knew his full address, if I had told anyone else. I showed her my phone, and that is when I realized he had been texting me again. Not anything threatening, just casual messages asking how I was doing, if I had tried that new coffee place downtown, if Benson was feeling better after his vet appointment. The thing is, I had never told him Benson was sick. I had posted about it on my private Instagram account the week before, the one I thought was locked down to only close friends. Faye scrolled through my followers list and found him there. a profile with no photo, and a generic username that I must have accepted without thinking months ago. He had been watching everything I posted, every story, every photo, every location tag. Faye grabbed my hand and looked me dead in the eyes and told me this was not normal, that this was stalking, and that I needed to document everything starting now. I wanted to believe she was overreacting, but somewhere deep in my gut I knew she was right. I blocked him on everything that same night. Instagram, the dating app, his phone number, even his email address that I found buried in an old message thread. For a few days things went quiet, and I started to let myself breathe again. Then the messages started coming from new numbers, different area codes, always the same tone. He would ask why I was ignoring him, say he just wanted to talk, insist that we had something special and I was throwing it away. One message said he drove by my apartment and noticed I had left my living room light on all night, asked if I was having trouble sleeping. That one made me sick to my stomach. I started parking in different spots, taking alternate routes to work, checking my rearview mirror constantly. My mom could tell something was wrong when I called her that weekend, and when I finally explained the situation, her voice went sharp with fear. She wanted me to come stay with her, to call the police, to do something. But I kept thinking about all the stories I had heard where women reported stalkers, and nothing happened until it was too late. I went to the police station on a Saturday morning, bringing printed screenshots of every message, every sighting, every piece of evidence I had collected. The officer who took my report was a heavy-set man in his 50s who listened with a tired expression that told me he had heard versions of this story 100 times before. He explained that unless Trevor made an explicit threat or physically harmed me, there was not much they could do. He suggested I vary my routine, stay aware of my surroundings, maybe look into a restraining order if things escalated. I asked him what counted as escalation, and he just shrugged and said I would know it when I saw it. Walking out of that station, I felt more alone than I had in years. The system that was supposed to protect me had essentially told me to wait until something terrible happened before they could help. I sat in my car in that parking lot and cried until I could not breathe. Then I wiped my face and drove to Faye's house because I could not stand the thought of being alone in my apartment. Faye lived in a small ranch-style house in a neighborhood about 15 minutes from the dental office. She had bought the place 2 years earlier, after her divorce, and it had become a second home to me during all those late nights when we would drink wine and complain about difficult patients. That Saturday afternoon, she met me at the door before I even knocked, pulling me into a hug that lasted longer than usual. I told her everything about the police visit, about the officer's shrug, about feeling like I was screaming into a void. She made me tea and sat across from me at her kitchen table, and together we came up with a plan. I would stay with her for a while just until things calmed down. I would keep documenting everything. We would look into hiring a lawyer, maybe pursue a civil restraining order since the criminal route seemed useless. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had some control over my own life again. Faye's house felt safe, tucked away on a quiet street lined with old oak trees, the kind of place where nothing bad ever seemed to happen. I went back to my apartment that Sunday to pack a bag and grab some things for the cats. The plan was to bring Benson and my younger cat Noodle to stay at Faye's until I figured out my next move. When I pulled into my parking spot, I noticed a folded piece of paper tucked under my windshield wiper. My chest tightened as I reached for it, already knowing who it was from. The handwriting was neat, almost careful, and the message was short. It said he knew I was scared, but that I did not need to be, that he would never hurt me, that we were meant to be together and eventually I would see that. He signed it with a small heart next to his name. I looked around the parking lot, scanning every car, every shadow, every window in the building surrounding mine. He could have been anywhere. He could have been watching me read his words at that very moment. I grabbed the note with shaking fingers, shoved it in my pocket, and practically ran to my apartment. I packed everything in under 20 minutes, stuffed both cats into their carriers despite their protests, and drove to Faye's house without stopping once. 3 days passed at Faye's place without incident, and I started to wonder if maybe the distance had finally made him lose interest. I kept going to work, kept documenting every unknown number that called, kept my head on a swivel whenever I walked to my car. Faye had installed a doorbell camera the year before, and we checked the footage religiously every evening, but it only ever showed delivery drivers and the occasional stray cat wandering through her yard. On the fourth night, a Wednesday, Faye had to work a late shift covering for another hygienist who called in sick. She told me to lock up tight, keep my phone charged, and call her if anything seemed strange. I made myself dinner, watched some mindless reality show on her couch, and tried to convince myself that this whole nightmare was finally winding down. Around 9 that evening, I took Benson and Noodle into the guest bedroom and settled in for an early night. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. I remember thinking how peaceful it felt, how grateful I was to have a friend like Faye, who would open her home to me without hesitation. I woke up sometime after 11 to the sound of knocking. Not loud or aggressive, just 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the front door. I sat up in bed, heart hammering, and grabbed my phone from the nightstand. There were no missed calls, no messages from Faye saying she was coming home early. I pulled up the doorbell camera app with trembling fingers and felt my entire body go cold when I saw who was standing on the porch. Trevor was looking directly into the camera, his face illuminated by the porch light, wearing that same calm smile he had given me at the sandwich shop weeks ago. He knocked again, 3 more slow taps, then leaned close to the camera and said my name. He said he knew I was inside, that he had followed me from my apartment days ago, that he just wanted to talk. His voice was soft, almost gentle, like he was coaxing a frightened animal out of hiding. I watched him through the screen as he tilted his head and asked why I was making this so difficult, why I could not just give us a real chance. I texted Faye with fingers that could barely hit the right keys, telling her he was here, begging her to call the police. For a few minutes, nothing happened. Trevor stood on the porch, occasionally glancing around the yard, checking his phone, acting like he had all the time in the world. I had moved into the hallway, crouched between the bathroom and the guest bedroom, trying to make myself as small as possible while keeping my eyes locked on the camera feed. Then I heard him walk off the porch, his footsteps crunching on the gravel path that led around the side of the house. I switched to the backyard camera and watched him approach the sliding glass door that opened into Faye's kitchen. He tested the handle, found it locked, and stood there for a moment with his hands pressed flat against the glass. The way he stared into the dark house made my skin prickle with a fear I had never felt before in my life. He pulled something from his jacket pocket, and I realized with horror that it was a small crowbar. The sound of metal against the door frame was loud enough to echo through the whole house. I called 911 with shaking hands, whispering my location and the situation to the dispatcher, who told me to stay hidden and that officers were on their way. I heard the glass shatter, heard his footsteps on the kitchen tile, heard him call my name again like we were playing some twisted game of hide and seek. I locked myself in the bathroom at the end of the hall, pressing my back against the door, clutching a pair of scissors I had grabbed from Faye's desk. His footsteps moved through the house slowly, methodically, opening doors and closing them one by one. He kept talking the whole time, his voice eerily calm, saying things like he forgave me for running, that he understood I was confused, that once we talked everything would make sense. When he reached the bathroom door, he knocked softly, the same 3 slow taps from before. He said my name and asked me to open up, promised he would not hurt me, said he just needed to see my face. I told him through the door that the police were coming, that he needed to leave now if he knew what was good for him. He laughed, a quiet sound that carried no humor at all, and said he did not care about the police, that they could not keep us apart. I heard him grip the doorknob, felt the door shudder as he put his weight against it. The wood around the lock started to splinter. I was screaming at that point, screaming for help, screaming for anyone to hear me. And then, like some kind of miracle, I heard sirens in the distance growing louder and louder. Trevor went silent. His footsteps retreated quickly down the hall, and I heard the back door slam. I stayed pressed against that bathroom door, scissors raised, until I heard officers announcing themselves inside the house. They caught Trevor 2 blocks away, running through someone's backyard with the crowbar still in his hand. He was arrested that night and charged with breaking and entering, stalking, and criminal trespass. Faye arrived at her house 20 minutes after the police, and she held me on her front lawn while I sobbed into her shoulder. The restraining order I filed the next day was granted immediately, and Trevor's bail was set high enough that he sat in county jail for 3 months awaiting trial. He eventually pleaded guilty to reduced charges and received 18 months in prison plus mandatory psychological evaluation. I moved out of my apartment and into a new place across town, somewhere he had never seen, somewhere I could start over. I changed my phone number, deleted all my social media, and spent months in therapy trying to untangle the fear that had wound itself around every part of my daily life. Faye still checks in on me almost every day, and my mom drove down to stay with me for the first few weeks after everything happened. It has been almost 8 months now, and I still double-check my locks every night, still look twice at every car parked near my building, still feel a jolt of panic whenever someone knocks on my door unexpectedly. I know Trevor will be released eventually, and that thought sits in the back of my mind like a stone I cannot swallow. But I also know that I did everything right, that I trusted my instincts, that I leaned on the people who loved me when I needed them most. If you're reading this and something similar is happening to you, please listen to me. Document everything. Tell everyone you trust, and never let anyone make you feel crazy for being afraid. Your fear is valid, your safety matters, and you deserve to be believed. Heather and I had been sharing an apartment in Tucson for almost 3 years when it happened. She was a medical transcriptionist who worked from home, spending long hours alone in our converted second bedroom with her headphones on, typing reports while I sat in a gray cubicle across town crunching numbers at an accounting firm. We had met at a friend's barbecue the summer after I graduated college in 2015, and something just clicked between us. She had this quiet intensity about her, a way of listening that made you feel like the only person in the room. I used to find that attractive. Now I understand it differently. Now I see how little I actually knew about what went on inside her head during all those silent hours, how the isolation of her job had been doing something to her, that I was too busy, too comfortable, too stupid to notice. October of 2022 started like any other month. Work was picking up as we headed toward the end of the fiscal year, and I found myself staying late more often than usual. One of the senior partners announced his retirement, and on that particular night, the whole office gathered at a bar downtown to celebrate. I texted Heather around 7 to say I would be home late. She sent back a thumbs-up emoji, nothing more. At the time, I appreciated how low maintenance she was, how she never guilt-tripped me or demanded constant updates on my whereabouts. That felt like trust. That felt like a healthy relationship. By the time I stumbled into an Uber around midnight, my head was fuzzy with beer, and my thoughts had already drifted to lazy weekend plans. Brunch at that new place she wanted to try. Maybe finally starting the puzzle her mom gave us last Christmas. Normal things. Safe things. I had no idea what was waiting for me in our dark apartment. When the driver pulled up to our building, I noticed that every window in our unit was completely dark. That was unusual because Heather always left the kitchen light on when she knew I would be coming home late. She said she liked the idea of me walking into something warm and welcoming rather than a pitch-black apartment. I figured she had just forgotten, or maybe fallen asleep early. The building was quiet as I climbed the stairs to the second floor, the kind of thick silence that only exists after midnight in residential neighborhoods. Our door was locked, which was normal, and I let myself in as quietly as I could, not wanting to wake her. The living room was empty, the television off, and I could see a thin strip of pale moonlight cutting across the hallway floor from our bedroom. I slipped off my shoes by the door and padded toward the bedroom, already loosening my tie. I pushed open the bedroom door, expecting to find Heather asleep, maybe curled up on her side the way she usually slept. Instead, she was sitting upright in bed, perfectly still, facing the doorway. The moonlight coming through the blinds fell across her in broken stripes, and I could see her eyes were wide open, fixed directly on me. She did not say hello. She did not move. She just sat there, hands folded in her lap, watching me with an expression I had never seen before. It was not anger, not exactly. It was something flatter, emptier, like she was looking at a stranger who had wandered into the wrong apartment. My first instinct was to ask if she was okay, if she had a nightmare, or could not sleep. But something about the way she held herself, that rigid stillness, made the words catch in my throat. The room felt 10 degrees colder than the rest of the apartment. I asked her what was wrong, keeping my voice soft, the way you might talk to a scared animal. She did not answer right away. For maybe 5 or 6 seconds, she just continued staring at me, and I became acutely aware of how loud my own breathing sounded in that silence. Then she spoke, and her voice came out flat and measured, almost robotic. She asked me who I had been with tonight. I told her about the retirement party, the same thing I had texted her earlier, but she shook her head slowly like I was lying. She said she knew I was with someone else, that she had been thinking about it all night, running through the evidence in her head. I tried to laugh it off, told her she was being ridiculous, that she could check my phone if she wanted. But she did not reach for my phone. She just kept staring with those hollow eyes, and I realized with a sinking feeling that this was not a normal bout of jealousy. Something had broken inside her while I was gone. I decided the best thing to do was to get into bed and let her calm down. Maybe she would feel better in the morning after some sleep, and we could talk about whatever was bothering her like rational adults. I walked around to my side of the bed, pulled back the covers, and sat down on the edge of the mattress to take off my socks. That is when I noticed her right hand had moved from her lap to somewhere beneath her pillow. I asked her what she had under there, trying to keep my tone casual even though my heart had started hammering in my chest. She said it was nothing, but the way her fingers curled around something out of sight, the way her whole body seemed to tense like a coiled spring, told me it was definitely not nothing. I asked her again, firmer this time, and she pulled her hand out slowly. In her grip was a kitchen knife, the big one we used for chopping vegetables, the blade catching the moonlight in a way that made my entire body go rigid. I raised both hands in front of me, palms out, the universal gesture of surrender. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to say, what to do, how to get that knife away from her without making things worse. I called her name softly, told her she was scaring me, asked her to please put the knife down so we could talk. She tilted her head to one side like a curious bird, studying me with that same empty expression. Then she said something that made my blood turn to ice in my veins. She said she had been watching me sleep for the past few weeks, standing over the bed in the dark, trying to decide what to do about me. She said she had seen the signs, the way I looked at my phone, the way I smiled at texts I thought she could not see. None of it was true, but in her mind she had constructed an entire alternate reality where I was the villain of her story. I started to inch backward off the bed, keeping my movements slow and deliberate, never breaking eye contact with her. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to bolt for the door and get out of that apartment as fast as my legs could carry me. But I also knew that sudden movements might trigger something, might push her over whatever edge she was balanced on. She watched me move with those unblinking eyes, the knife still clutched in her fist, and I could see a vein pulsing in her neck. When my feet touched the floor on the far side of the bed, I told her I was going to get her some water, that maybe she was dehydrated or having some kind of episode. I took one step toward the door. That was when she lunged. She came across the bed faster than I would have thought possible, the knife slashing through the air in a wide arc aimed directly at my chest. I threw myself backward and felt the blade whistle past my face, missing my throat by what could not have been more than an inch. I crashed into the dresser behind me, knocking over a lamp and a framed photo of us from happier times. The glass shattered against the floor, and for a split second I thought about grabbing a shard to defend myself, but there was no time. Heather was already coming at me again, her movements jerky and uncoordinated, like a marionette being controlled by someone who did not quite know how the strings worked. I managed to grab her wrist as she swung the knife down toward my shoulder, and we struggled there in the darkness, her breath hot against my face, her eyes wild with something I can only describe as complete disconnection from reality. She was stronger than I expected, fueled by whatever storm was raging inside her head, and I could feel my grip slipping as she twisted and thrashed. I screamed her name over and over, begging her to stop, to come back to me, but it was like talking to a wall. The woman I loved was gone, replaced by something I did not recognize. I finally managed to twist her arm at an angle that forced her to drop the knife. It clattered to the floor somewhere in the darkness, and I kicked it away as hard as I could, hearing it skid across the hardwood and disappear under the bed. But even without the weapon, she did not stop. She clawed at my face, my arms, my chest, her fingernails raking deep grooves into my skin. I had no choice but to wrap my arms around her and pin her against me, holding her as tight as I could, while she screamed and thrashed and called me names I had never heard her use before. She accused me of poisoning her, of putting cameras in the walls, of working with her co-workers to ruin her life. None of it made sense. All of it terrified me. I held her like that for what felt like hours but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes, until finally, her body went limp, and she started to sob against my chest like a child waking from a nightmare. I called 911 with one hand while keeping my other arm wrapped around her. The dispatcher asked me a series of questions I could barely process, my voice shaking as I tried to explain that my girlfriend had just tried to kill me, but that I thought she was having some kind of mental breakdown. They sent police and paramedics, and I sat there on the bedroom floor with Heather crying in my arms, blood trickling down my face from where her nails had torn my skin, waiting for help to arrive. She kept mumbling apologies between sobs, saying she did not know what happened, that she had been so scared, that she thought I was going to hurt her first. I wanted to be angry. Part of me was angry, furious even, at how close I had come to dying in my own bedroom at the hands of someone I trusted completely. But mostly, I just felt hollow, like someone had scooped out everything inside me and left only a shell sitting there on that cold floor. The paramedics took Heather to the hospital for a psychiatric evaluation, and I spent the next several hours at the police station giving my statement. The officers were surprisingly kind, one of them a woman named Tara, who brought me coffee and told me her brother had gone through something similar with his wife years ago. When I finally got back to the apartment the next morning, the sun was already up, and everything looked so painfully normal in the daylight. The broken lamp, the scattered glass, the scratch marks on my arms, those were the only evidence that anything had happened at all. I found the knife under the bed where I had kicked it, and I just stared at it for a long time, trying to reconcile that ordinary kitchen utensil with the weapon that had nearly ended my life. I also found something else that day, something that made everything click into place in the worst possible way. In the back of her closet, hidden inside an old shoebox, were dozens of handwritten notes filled with paranoid ramblings about me, about her co-workers, about neighbors she believed were spying on her. Some of them dated back over 6 months. Heather was diagnosed with a severe psychotic disorder that had apparently been developing for much longer than either of us realized. The doctors told me that her isolation, working alone from home day after day with minimal human contact, had likely accelerated whatever was already brewing in her brain chemistry. She had been hiding her symptoms, masking them behind that quiet intensity I once found so attractive, convincing herself that her paranoid thoughts were valid concerns rather than warning signs of something deeply wrong. I visited her once at the psychiatric facility, where they transferred her after the initial evaluation. She looked smaller somehow, fragile in a way I had never seen before, and she cried when she saw the healing scratches on my face. She told me she remembered everything but that it had felt like watching herself from outside her own body, powerless to stop what was happening. I believed her. I also knew that I could never sleep next to her again, never close my eyes in her presence without seeing that knife glinting in the moonlight. It has been almost 2 years since that night, and I still sleep with my bedroom door locked. I moved to a different city, started over at a new firm, and eventually began seeing a therapist who specializes in trauma from domestic violence. That label felt strange at first, domestic violence, because I had always pictured something different when I heard those words. But my therapist helped me understand that what happened to me counts, that the scars on my arms and the ones inside my head are real and valid regardless of the circumstances that caused them. Heather is still receiving treatment, and her mother sends me updates occasionally that I am never quite sure how to respond to. Sometimes I think about the version of our life that existed before that October night, the weekend brunches, and unfinished puzzles and lazy Sunday mornings. And it feels like remembering a movie I watched a long time ago, rather than something I actually lived. The hardest part is not the fear, though that still surfaces sometimes when I wake up in the dark and have to remind myself where I am. The hardest part is knowing that the danger was there all along, sleeping right beside me, and I never saw it until the blade was already swinging toward my throat. Still trying to put all of this into words because I spent so long convincing myself it was normal. I met Wesley at a coworker's birthday party in the spring of 2022, and he seemed like everything I had been looking for after years of terrible dates and even worse relationships. Charming, attentive, the kind of guy who remembered small details about conversations we had weeks before. My friends from nursing school kept saying I deserved someone like him. We moved in together after 8 months, and for a while, everything was perfect. He cooked dinner most nights, surprised me with flowers on random Tuesdays, called me during his lunch breaks just to hear my voice. I remember telling my mom on the phone that I finally understood what people meant when they said they found their person. She was so happy for me, and I was so certain I had figured out my life. My coworkers at the pediatric clinic where I worked used to tease me about how often I smiled at my phone when he texted. 26 years old, and convinced this was it, the real thing, the kind of love that actually lasts. The first time I saw Wesley drunk was at his company's holiday party that December. He had always been a social drinker around me, a beer or two with dinner, maybe a glass of wine on weekends, nothing that ever raised any concern. But that night he kept going back to the open bar, shot after shot, laughing too loud with his coworkers while I stood there not knowing anyone. By the time we left, he was someone I did not recognize. In the Uber home, he accused me of flirting with his boss, said I had embarrassed him in front of everyone by laughing at some joke the guy made. I tried to explain that I was just being polite, making small talk like anyone would at a work event, but he kept cutting me off, his voice getting louder each time. The driver kept glancing at us through the rearview mirror, and I wanted to disappear into the seat. When we got home, Wesley slammed the front door so hard a picture frame fell off the wall, then went straight to bed without another word. The next morning, he apologized with tears in his eyes, said the stress at work had been overwhelming, and he had drunk way more than he should have. He promised it would never happen again, and I believed him because I wanted to believe him. For a few months after that, things went back to normal. Wesley cut back on drinking, at least around me, and I let myself forget how scared I had been in that Uber. We adopted a cat together, started talking about maybe getting engaged by the end of the year. I convinced myself that the holiday party was just a one-time thing, a bad night, the kind of story couples laugh about years later. But then his friend Todd had a bachelor party in March, and Wesley came home at 3 in the morning reeking of whiskey and stumbling into furniture. I was half asleep when I heard the front door open, and before I could even sit up, he was standing in the bedroom doorway asking why I had not answered his texts. I checked my phone, and there were 17 messages, each one angrier than the last, accusing me of ignoring him on purpose. I had been asleep. My phone was on silent because I had an early shift the next morning, but trying to explain that only made him angrier. He called me selfish, said I did not care about him, that any other girlfriend would have stayed up waiting. That became the pattern. Sober Wesley was sweet and considerate, the man I had fallen in love with. But when he drank, something shifted behind his eyes, and I never knew which version of him was coming home. Some nights he would just get quiet and pass out on the couch, and I would cover him with a blanket and feel relieved. Other nights he would pick fights over nothing, over dishes I had left in the sink, or a text from a male coworker he had seen on my phone. The accusations always came back to the same thing: that I was cheating, that I was looking at other men, that I did not love him enough. I started being careful about everything. I stopped mentioning male coworkers by name. I made sure the apartment was spotless before he got home on weekends when I knew he had been out with friends. I kept my phone face down on the table so he would not see notifications and get suspicious. I did not realize it then, but I was slowly shrinking my entire life to avoid setting him off. The isolation happened so gradually, I barely noticed it. First, it was my friend Kira, who Wesley said was a bad influence because she was single and liked going to bars. Then it was my coworker June, who he claimed looked at him weird at a work event I had brought him to. One by one, he found reasons why the people in my life were problems. He never told me I could not see them, not directly. He just made it so exhausting that it was easier to stop trying. If I went out with friends, I would come home to hours of silent treatment or interrogation about where I had really been. If I talked on the phone with my mom for too long, he would sulk and say I cared more about her than about him. By the summer of 2023, my world had narrowed down to work and Wesley. I told myself it was just a phase, that once things calmed down at his job, he would go back to being the man I had fallen for. I kept waiting for that version of him to come back permanently. Then I lost my job. Budget cuts at the clinic meant they had to let go of 3 nurses, and I was one of them because I had the least seniority. I remember sitting in my car in the parking lot after cleaning out my locker, crying and dreading having to tell Wesley. When I got home, he was surprisingly supportive at first. He said we would figure it out together, that I should take some time before jumping into another job, that he made enough to cover us both for a while. It felt like the old Wesley, the one who took care of me, and I let myself lean into that. But within a few weeks, the dynamic shifted in ways I had not expected. Suddenly every purchase I made was questioned. A coffee from the drive-thru, a new tube of mascara, groceries that he deemed too expensive. He started giving me a weekly allowance from our joint account, said it was just until I found something new, just to help us budget. I went from being an independent woman with my own income to asking permission to buy shampoo. And the worst part is that I felt guilty, like I owed him for supporting me, like I had no right to complain. The drinking got worse after that. Maybe it was the pressure of being the sole provider, or maybe he just stopped hiding it now that I was home all day with nowhere to go. He started keeping whiskey in the kitchen cabinet, bourbon on the nightstand. What used to be weekend drinking became every night drinking. I learned to gauge his mood by the sound of the bottle cap twisting open, by how many times I heard the clink of ice in his glass before dinner. 2 drinks meant he would be fine, maybe a little louder than usual, but manageable. 4 or more meant I needed to stay quiet, agree with everything, make myself small. I started cooking his favorite meals on nights when he seemed tense, thinking maybe if I just did everything right, he would not have a reason to get upset. I became an expert at reading the room, at noticing the slight tightening of his jaw, or the way he scrolled through his phone too aggressively. My whole existence revolved around preventing the next explosion. One night in October, he came home from a work happy hour already drunk. I could smell it on him the second he walked through the door, that sour mix of beer and something stronger. I was on the couch watching a cooking show, and he sat down next to me without saying anything. After a few minutes, he asked who I had been texting. I told him no one, because I had not touched my phone in hours. He grabbed it off the coffee table and started going through my messages, my photos, my email. I just sat there, too tired to argue, too scared to protest. When he did not find anything, he threw the phone back at me and said I must have deleted whatever I was hiding. Then he went to the kitchen and poured himself another drink. I stayed on that couch for 2 more hours, not moving, barely breathing, just waiting for him to pass out so I could finally exhale. That was my life. Not constant violence, not bruises I had to explain, just this endless waiting, this permanent state of dread that never fully went away even on the good days. I thought about leaving all the time. I would lie awake at night running through the logistics in my head, trying to figure out how I could make it work. But the math never added up. I had no savings because Wesley controlled our finances. I had no job because I had been too anxious to interview properly, too exhausted from walking on eggshells to put together a decent resume. My name was not on the lease. My car was in his name because he had co-signed when my credit was not good enough. The few friends I had left lived in other states, and my mom was in a one-bedroom apartment with no space for me. Every path out led to a dead end, and Wesley knew it. He never said it out loud, but I could see it in the way he looked at me sometimes, this quiet confidence that I was not going anywhere. He would apologize after the bad nights, buy me flowers, promise to cut back on drinking, and I would stay because what else was I supposed to do? Sleep in my car, show up at my mother's door like a failure, start over with nothing at 27 years old. The night everything changed was a Saturday in November. Wesley had been drinking since noon because his college football team was playing some big rivalry game. By the time the game ended, he had finished most of a bottle of bourbon and was louder than I had ever seen him. I made the mistake of asking if he wanted me to order some food, thinking maybe getting something in his stomach would help. He snapped at me, said I was always nagging, always trying to control him. I apologized and went to the bedroom to get away from it, but he followed me. He stood in the doorway blocking my exit, going on about how I thought I was better than him, how I looked down on him for drinking, how I was probably planning to leave him the second I got a job. I kept saying I was not. I was not. I just wanted to order dinner, but he kept getting closer, backing me toward the wall, his voice getting louder until he was screaming inches from my face. I could feel the heat of his breath, could see the veins in his neck. He punched the wall right next to my head, and I felt the impact vibrate through my whole body. Something broke inside me in that moment. Not in a dramatic way, not like in the movies where the victim suddenly fights back. It was quieter than that. I just looked at the hole in the drywall, at the plastered dust on his knuckles, and I knew with absolute certainty that next time, it would be my face. Maybe not the next fight, maybe not even the one after that, but eventually. I could see the trajectory so clearly, like watching a car slide on ice toward a guardrail. He stormed out of the room after that, grabbed his keys, and left. I heard his truck peel out of the driveway, and I stood there staring at that hole in the wall for what felt like an hour. Then I called my mom. I had not really talked to her in months, had kept our conversation short and surface level because I did not want her to know how bad things had gotten. But that night I told her everything, and she listened without interrupting, and when I was done, she just said, "Come home." She would figure out the space. She would help me find a job. Just come home. I left the next morning while Wesley was still passed out. I took one suitcase, my cat, and my phone charger. I left behind 2 years of clothes, furniture we had picked out together, a life I had thought was going to be forever. I gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white, and I kept checking the rearview mirror expecting to see his truck behind me. The drive to my mom's place took 4 hours, and I cried for most of it, not because I was sad, but because I was terrified and relieved and angry at myself for staying so long. It has been almost a year now. I have a new job at a hospital 2 towns over from my mom. I am saving money, slowly rebuilding the friendships I let wither, learning how to exist without constantly scanning for danger. Wesley tried to contact me for a few months after I left. Texts that cycled between apologetic and threatening, voicemails where he sobbed and begged and then called me names in the same breath. I changed my number eventually, blocked him on everything. Some days I still flinch when I hear ice clinking in a glass, still tense up when someone raises their voice unexpectedly. I do not know if that ever fully goes away, but I got out. That is the part I need people to understand. It took me way too long, and I lost so much of myself in the process, but I got out. And if anyone reading this sees their own life in these words, please know that the logistics that seem impossible, the obstacles that feel insurmountable, they can be figured out. There are people who will help you. You just have to reach out, even when every part of you is convinced that you cannot. February in Minneapolis has a way of making everything feel frozen in place. Not just the ice on the sidewalks, but time itself. Like the whole world is holding its breath waiting for spring. I remember that feeling perfectly the week my life started crumbling. Walking home from the clinic where I worked as a physical therapist, my boots crunching through gray slush while my phone buzzed with messages I was too exhausted to check. My graduating class from the University of Minnesota had their 10-year reunion coming up that May, which gives you an idea of where I was in life. Finally established in my career, proud of the small house I had scraped together enough savings to buy in a quiet neighborhood near Powderhorn Park. Cautiously optimistic for the first time in years. I had been with Julian for almost 3 years by then. Met him at a friend's barbecue, fell hard and fast, moved in together after 8 months. He was charming in that effortless way that made everyone gravitate toward him at parties. He remembered birthdays, asked about your sick aunt, brought wine to dinner gatherings. My friends loved him. My mom called him the one. I believed it too, right up until the moment I found the messages on his phone from not one, not two, but 4 different women. When I confronted him, he cried. When I told him to leave, he begged. When I changed the locks, he went silent. That silence should have been a relief. Instead, it was the calm before something I never could have anticipated. The first sign came 3 days after I asked him to move out. My coworker Janine, someone I had known for 6 years and considered one of my closest friends, stopped responding to my texts. At first I figured she was busy. Her daughter had just started kindergarten. Her husband was traveling for work. But when I saw her in the break room that Friday, she looked at me with this expression I had never seen before. It was cold, almost pitying, like I was someone she had just heard terrible things about. She made small talk for maybe 30 seconds before excusing herself, and I stood there holding my coffee mug, completely confused. That weekend, my friend Troy from college texted me something strange. "Hey, Julian reached out. I didn't know things got that bad between you two. Hope you're getting the help you need." I read that message probably 15 times trying to decode it. What help? What had Julian told him? I called Troy immediately, but he let it go to voicemail. When he finally called back 2 days later, his voice had that careful, measured tone people use when they think they are talking to someone unstable. Troy told me that Julian had called him crying, saying he was worried about me, saying that I had been struggling with some issues, and that the breakup had pushed me over the edge. According to Julian, I had been having paranoid episodes, accusing him of things he never did, making up affairs that existed only in my imagination. He told Troy that he still loved me and wanted me to get better, that he was only reaching out because he cared about my well-being. Troy asked me, gently, carefully, like he was talking to a child holding a knife, if I had considered seeing a therapist. I sat there on my couch with the phone pressed to my ear, my whole body going numb as I realized what was happening. Julian was not just moving on. He was rewriting our entire relationship, and he was using everyone I cared about to do it. I tried to explain the truth, the messages I found, the women, the lies, but I could hear the doubt in Troy's silence. Julian had gotten to him first, and now everything I said just sounded like the ravings of a woman who could not accept reality. Over the next 2 weeks, the pattern repeated itself with sickening precision. My cousin Elise, who I had been close with since childhood, called to say she was there for me, in a way that made it clear she thought I was falling apart. My neighbor Wanda, an older woman who had always waved at me from her garden, started avoiding eye contact when I walked past. My supervisor at the clinic, a no-nonsense woman named Francine who I had always respected, pulled me into her office to ask if everything was okay at home, because someone had reached out with concerns. I asked who. She said she was not at liberty to say, but her eyes told me everything I needed to know. Julian was methodical. He was patient. He picked the people who mattered most to me, the ones whose opinions I valued, whose support I relied on. and he poisoned each of them one by one. And the worst part was that he did it while wearing the mask of a concerned ex-boyfriend who just wanted me to be okay. He made himself look like the victim by pretending to be worried about the real victim. He was so good at it that sometimes, in my darkest moments, I wondered if maybe he was right. Maybe I was the crazy one. Maybe I had imagined everything. I started keeping a folder on my phone with screenshots of everything. The original messages I found on his phone before he could delete them, the texts from friends asking if I was okay, timestamps and dates for every strange interaction. I needed proof, not just for other people but for myself, because the constant gaslighting was starting to make me question my own memories. That folder became my lifeline, a reminder that I was not losing my mind, that the things I remembered had actually happened. But Julian was escalating. 3 weeks after the breakup, I came home from work to find a bouquet of white lilies on my doorstep. My favorite flowers, the ones he used to buy me on our anniversary. There was no card, no note, nothing to indicate who had left them. When I texted him asking if they were from him, he replied with a single question mark, like he had no idea what I was talking about. The next morning, I found another bouquet in the exact same spot. This time I checked my doorbell camera, but the footage showed nothing. Just an empty porch one frame and flowers the next, as if they had materialized out of thin air. I went through the settings and realized someone had deleted the footage remotely. Julian still had the password from when we set up the system together, and I had never thought to change it. That realization sent me spiraling into a kind of fear I had never experienced before. If he could access my doorbell camera, what else could he see? I spent that entire Saturday changing every password I could think of: email, bank accounts, streaming services, the smart thermostat, even the Wi-Fi router. My fingers were trembling so badly that I kept making typos and having to start over. I called my phone provider and asked them to check if there were any unknown devices linked to my account. There were two. One was an old tablet I'd forgotten about. The other was a phone I had never seen before, added to my account 3 months ago while Julian and I were still together. The representative's voice was calm and professional as she helped me remove it, but I could barely hear her over the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. He had been tracking me. For months, maybe longer, he had been watching where I went, reading my messages, listening to my calls. Every private conversation I thought I was having in confidence, with my mom, with my friends, with my therapist. He had access to all of it. That was how he knew exactly who to contact, exactly what to say, exactly which buttons to push to make people doubt me. I had been living inside his surveillance the whole time, like an insect trapped under glass, thinking I was free while he watched my every move. I went to the police the next morning, a Sunday, sitting in that fluorescent-lit waiting room for almost 2 hours before an officer finally called my name. His name tag said Officer Hendricks, a heavy-set man with tired eyes who looked like he had heard 1,000 stories just like mine. I showed him everything: the screenshots, the deleted camera footage, the unauthorized device on my phone account, the messages from friends proving Julian was contacting them behind my back. He listened, nodded, took notes in a little spiral pad, and then told me there was not much they could do. Julian had not made any direct threats. The flowers could have been from anyone. Accessing a shared account was not technically illegal if he had been given the password at some point. Hendricks suggested I get a restraining order if I felt unsafe, but warned me that without evidence of physical threat or harassment, it probably would not be granted. I walked out of that station feeling smaller than I had ever felt in my life. The system was not designed to protect people like me from people like Julian. It was designed to wait until something terrible happened, and then maybe, if I was lucky, do something about it afterward. The confrontation happened 4 days later, on a Wednesday evening that started out almost peaceful. I had just gotten home from work and was heating up leftover soup when my doorbell rang. I checked the camera. I had changed all the passwords, installed new software, done everything I could to lock Julian out, and saw him standing on my porch. He was wearing the blue sweater I had bought him for his birthday, the one he knew I loved. and he was holding a single white lily in his hand. My whole body went rigid. I did not answer the door. I watched him through the camera as he stood there for 1 minute, then 2, then 5, his expression shifting from patient to annoyed to something darker, something I had only glimpsed a few times during our relationship. He leaned close to the camera, close enough that I could see the pores on his nose, and said in a voice so calm it made my skin prickle, "I know you're watching, sweetheart. I know you're always watching. But you should know that I'm watching too, and I'm much better at this game than you are." Then he smiled, placed the lily gently on the doormat, and walked away into the darkness. I did not sleep that night. I sat on my couch with every light in the house turned on, a kitchen knife on the cushion beside me, watching the doorbell camera feed on my phone until my eyes burned. The next few days blurred together in a haze of exhaustion and paranoia. I started taking different routes to work, leaving at odd hours, parking in different spots every day. I told Francine I was dealing with a personal situation and asked to adjust my schedule so I would never be alone at the clinic during opening or closing. She agreed, but I could see the concern in her eyes. Not concern for my safety, but concern about my mental state, which meant Julian's story had already taken root. I stopped answering calls from numbers I did not recognize. I stopped checking my mailbox for days at a time because I was afraid of what I might find there. My mother called me one evening, and the first thing she said was, "Honey, Julian came by the house today. He's really worried about you." I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. He had driven 3 hours to my mother's house in St. Cloud, sat in her living room, drank her coffee, and told her God knows what about me. When I tried to explain the truth, my own mother, the woman who raised me, who knew me better than anyone, hesitated before saying, "Sweetheart, maybe you should talk to someone, a professional. Julian said you've been having episodes, and I just want to make sure you're okay." I hung up on her. It was the first time in my life I had ever done that, and I immediately felt sick with guilt, but I could not listen to another word. That Friday, I came home to find my back door unlocked. I knew I had locked it. I had started checking every lock 3 times before leaving, a new ritual born from fear. But when I turned the handle, it swung open without resistance. Nothing inside seemed disturbed. My laptop was still on the kitchen table where I had left it. My jewelry box was untouched. But something was different, something I could not identify at first. A wrongness in the air that made my lungs feel tight. Then I saw it. On my bedroom pillow, placed exactly in the center like a mint at a hotel, was a photograph. It was a picture of me sleeping, taken from inside my own bedroom, the angle suggesting the photographer had been standing right next to my bed. I was wearing the old college t-shirt I had slept in 2 nights ago. My mouth was slightly open. I looked peaceful, completely unaware that someone was standing over me in the dark, watching me close enough to touch me. On the back of the photo, written in Julian's handwriting, were 4 words. "You look so peaceful." I do not remember calling the police. I do not remember what I said to them. I only remember sitting on my front steps in the cold, shaking so hard my teeth were chattering, waiting for the sirens while the photograph sat on the ground beside me like a dead thing I could not bear to touch again. This time, they had to take me seriously. The officers who responded that night were different from Officer Hendricks. A woman named Sergeant Adler took one look at the photograph, the handwriting on the back, and the doorbell footage from the week before, and her jaw tightened in a way that told me she understood exactly what she was looking at. She asked me detailed questions about Julian, his full name, his address, his workplace, his vehicle, his habits. She took the photograph as evidence, dusted my back door for fingerprints, and had a locksmith come out that same night to change every lock in my house and install a deadbolt on my bedroom door. Before she left, she gave me her card and told me to call her directly if anything else happened, day or night. "Men like this," she said, standing on my porch with her hand resting on her belt, "they don't stop on their own. They stop when the consequences become real for them, or they don't stop at all. We're going to make sure the consequences become very real." The restraining order was filed the next morning, and this time it was granted. Julian was served at his workplace, in front of his colleagues, which I later learned was intentional on Sergeant Adler's part. She wanted to crack his perfect image, to let people see that the charming, concerned ex-boyfriend was actually under a court order to stay away from the woman he claimed to be worried about. For a while it worked. Julian kept his distance, at least physically. The flowers stopped appearing. My back door stayed locked. But the damage to my reputation had already been done, and I spent the following months trying to rebuild relationships that had been poisoned by his lies. Some people came around once they heard about the restraining order, once they realized that the situation was serious enough for the courts to get involved. Troy called to apologize, sounding genuinely shaken. My mother drove down from St. Cloud and sat with me for 3 days, crying and holding my hand and saying she was sorry she had not believed me. But others never came back. Janine transferred to a different clinic without ever speaking to me again. My cousin Elise sent me a long message saying she did not want to take sides and thought it was best if we took a break from our friendship. I learned something important during that time. You can tell people the truth, you can show them evidence, you can have the law on your side, and some of them will still choose to believe the version of reality that is easier for them to accept. Julian had planted seeds of doubt so deep that even proof could not dig them out. I still live in Minneapolis, still work at the same clinic, still walk the same streets I walked when I was with him. But I'm not the same person I was before. I check my locks obsessively. I keep pepper spray in my purse and a bat beside my bed. I look over my shoulder when I walk to my car at night. And sometimes when the light hits a stranger's face a certain way, my heart still pounds like it is trying to escape my chest. Julian moved out of state 8 months after the restraining order was filed. I know because Sergeant Adler calls me every few months to give me updates, a kindness I never expected from the system that had initially failed me. But even with him gone, even with an entire state between us, I cannot shake the feeling that he is still watching. That somewhere out there, he is waiting for the restraining order to expire, waiting for me to let my guard down, waiting for his next opportunity to remind me that he is much better at this game than I am. I hope I never find out if that feeling is right. Sometimes I still catch myself checking the locks twice before bed, even though Wes moved out over a year ago. Old habits, I guess. We were together for almost 2 years, living in a small apartment in Louisville, Kentucky, the kind of place with thin walls where you could hear your neighbors arguing about whose turn it was to take out the trash. I met him through mutual friends at a barbecue. Nothing special, just burgers and cheap beer in someone's backyard. He was funny, charming, had this way of listening to you like every word mattered. By the time my class of 2012 reunion rolled around, we were already sharing a lease and talking about getting a dog. My old classmates kept telling me how happy I looked, how lucky I was to find someone like him, and for a while I believed them. I work as a nurse at a local hospital, long shifts that leave you exhausted, and coming home to Wes felt like a relief back then. He would have dinner ready, ask about my day, make me laugh after 12 hours of dealing with difficult patients. That version of him feels like a stranger now. The first time he scared me was over something stupid. Dishes in the sink. He had left them piling up for 3 days, and I made a comment about it when I got home from work. Nothing mean, just tired, like, hey, can you take care of that tomorrow? He turned around so fast I stepped back without thinking. His whole face changed, jaw tight, eyes hard, and he slammed his fist into the kitchen counter. The laminate cracked right down the middle. That sound, that sharp crack, I can still hear it if I think about it too long. We stood there in silence for what felt like forever. Then he apologized, said work had been stressful, said it would never happen again. I wanted to believe him, so I did. That is what you do when you love someone. You tell yourself it was a one-time thing. You file it away in the back of your mind, and you move forward. But things like that, they do not stay filed away. They sit there, waiting. After that night, things were good for a few months. Wes started seeing a therapist, said he wanted to work on his anger issues, and I thought we had turned a corner. He bought me flowers, planned weekend trips, did all the things that made me fall for him in the first place. I convinced myself that the counter incident was an isolated event, a glitch in an otherwise healthy relationship. But then, there was the time he punched a hole in the bedroom wall because I forgot to text him when I got to work. And the time he threw his phone across the room so hard it shattered against the refrigerator because his boss criticized him during a meeting. Each time he apologized. Each time he promised to do better. And each time, I noticed that the explosions were getting closer together, the triggers smaller. I started monitoring my own behavior, choosing my words carefully, tiptoeing around certain topics. I did not realize it then, but I was slowly shrinking myself to fit into the spaces his anger left behind. The day everything changed started like any other Saturday. We slept in, made breakfast together, watched some documentary about deep-sea creatures that Wes had been wanting to see. Around noon, he said he wanted to talk about something important. His voice was calm, almost too calm, and he asked me to sit down on the couch. I remember thinking he was going to propose, that all the therapy had worked and he was ready for the next step. Instead, he told me that his therapist had helped him identify something about himself. He said he had been having violent thoughts, intrusive ones, that came to him during moments when he felt overwhelmed or upset. He described them as flashes, images that appeared in his mind without warning. He said sometimes, when we argued, he would picture himself hurting me, choking me, hitting me. He said the images were so vivid that he could almost feel his hands doing it. I sat there on that couch, our breakfast dishes still in the sink. The TV paused on a shot of some bioluminescent fish, and I had no idea what to say. He kept talking, filling the silence I could not fill. He said his therapist told him these were intrusive thoughts, that lots of people have them, that they do not mean he would ever act on them. He said the fact that he was disturbed by these images was actually a good sign, proof that he was not a violent person at his core. He reached for my hand while he spoke and I let him take it, but my fingers felt numb, disconnected from the rest of my body. He said he wanted to be honest with me because he loved me, because he trusted me, because hiding this felt like a betrayal. I remember nodding, saying something like, "I appreciate you telling me," but my voice sounded far away, like it belonged to someone else. The whole time he was talking, I kept thinking about all those moments when his face would change during arguments, when his eyes would go dark and empty for just a second before he caught himself. I always thought he was just angry. Now I knew what he was seeing in those moments. He was seeing his hands around my throat. That night I could not sleep. Wes fell asleep easily, the way he always did, like confessing something that heavy had lifted a weight off his shoulders. I lay there next to him in the dark, listening to him breathe, and I could not stop my mind from racing. Every time he shifted in his sleep, I flinched. Every time his arm brushed against mine, I tensed up. I kept replaying his words, trying to convince myself that he was right, that intrusive thoughts were normal, that having them did not make him dangerous. But then I thought about the cracked counter, the hole in the wall, the shattered phone. Those were not thoughts, those were actions. And the line between thinking about violence and committing violence suddenly seemed very thin, almost invisible. I got up around 4 in the morning, went to the kitchen, and just stood there in the dark looking at the crack in the laminate that we never got fixed. I traced it with my finger, feeling the rough edge where his fist had landed, and I wondered how many times he had pictured doing that to my face instead. The next few weeks were the hardest of my life. I tried to act normal, to pretend that his confession had not changed everything between us, but it had. I started noticing things I had ignored before. The way he would clench his jaw when I said something he did not like. The way his hands would ball into fists during small disagreements, even when his voice stayed calm. The way he would stare at me sometimes, just stare, with this blank expression that I used to think meant he was lost in thought. Now I wondered what thoughts he was lost in. I called my sister one afternoon while Wes was at work, and I tried to explain what he had told me without making it sound too alarming. She was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then she asked me a question that I could not answer. She asked if I felt safe. I told her yes because that was what I was supposed to say, but the word tasted like a lie in my mouth. The truth was, I did not know anymore. The truth was I had started hiding the kitchen knives in a different drawer, one he would not think to check. A month after his confession, we had an argument about money. Something small, a credit card bill that was higher than expected. Wes was already in a bad mood because of something that happened at his job, and my comment about the bill set him off. He did not hit me. He did not even raise his voice at first. But he backed me into a corner of the living room, literally, physically backed me into a corner with his body, and he stood there breathing hard, his face inches from mine. I could smell the coffee on his breath, see the vein pulsing in his neck. He did not say anything for what felt like a full minute. He just stood there, blocking my path, his fists clenched at his sides. And in that moment I knew with absolute certainty that he was seeing one of those images. He was seeing himself hurting me. I could tell by the way his eyes flickered, the way his whole body seemed to vibrate with something he was trying to hold back. Then he stepped away, walked to the bedroom, and closed the door. I stayed in that corner for 10 minutes, my back pressed against the wall, too scared to move. I started making a plan after that night. Nothing dramatic, just small things. I opened a separate bank account and started putting a little money in it every week. I made copies of my important documents and left them at my sister's place. I started keeping my car keys in my pocket, instead of on the hook by the door. Wes noticed something was different, I could tell, but he did not say anything directly. Instead, he became sweeter, more attentive, like he was trying to make up for something he had not technically done. He brought me flowers, cooked my favorite meals, told me he loved me more often than usual. Part of me wanted to believe that he was trying, that the therapy was working, that we could still make this work. But another part of me, the part that had stood in that corner watching his fists clench and unclench, knew better. I read articles online about intrusive thoughts, trying to understand what he was going through. The articles said these thoughts were common, that most people who have them never act on them, that they were more distressing to the person having them than to anyone else. But those articles were not written about people who had already punched holes in walls. They were not written about people who backed their partners into corners and stood there vibrating with barely contained rage. The day I finally left started like any other morning. We had coffee together, talked about nothing important, and he kissed me goodbye before heading to work. I waited until his car turned the corner at the end of our street. Then I moved faster than I had ever moved in my life. I had already packed a bag and hidden it in the trunk of my car 2 days earlier. I grabbed my laptop, the folder with my documents, and the small box where I kept jewelry my grandmother had left me. I took one last look at the apartment, at the cracked counter and the patched hole in the bedroom wall and the couch where he had told me about the images in his head. Then I walked out, and I did not look back. I drove to my sister's house 3 hours away, checking my rearview mirror the whole time, half expecting to see his car following me. He called me 17 times that afternoon. I did not answer. I sent him one text message that evening, telling him it was over, telling him not to contact me again. He responded with a wall of text, apologies and promises and accusations all mixed together, ending with a sentence that still keeps me up at night. He wrote that he had never been closer to acting on those thoughts than he was at that moment. I blocked his number after that message, blocked him on every social media platform I could think of, and told my sister not to tell anyone where I was staying. For weeks I jumped every time my phone buzzed, every time a car drove slowly past the house, every time someone knocked on the door. My sister installed extra locks and bought a security camera for the front porch. I filed for a restraining order, which was granted after I showed the judge the text message he had sent me. The judge read it twice, looked at me over her glasses, and asked if I had somewhere safe to stay. I told her I did. What I did not tell her was that I still woke up in the middle of the night sometimes, heart pounding, certain that I had heard his footsteps in the hallway. I did not tell her that I had started sleeping with a baseball bat next to my bed. or that I flinched whenever a man raised his voice in public. Some things you do not say out loud because saying them makes them too real. You just carry them with you, like stones in your pockets, and you hope that someday they will feel lighter. It has been 14 months since I left. Wes tried to contact me a few times through mutual friends, but they all told him to leave me alone. Last I heard, he moved to another state, somewhere out west, and started dating someone new. I think about her sometimes, this woman I have never met, and I wonder if he told her what he told me. I wonder if she notices the way his eyes go empty during arguments, if she has started hiding things without knowing why, if she lies awake at night wondering about the line between a thought and an action. I hope she is safe. I hope he really is just someone with intrusive thoughts who would never act on them. But I also know what I felt in that corner, pressed against the wall, watching him fight against something inside himself. I know what I read in that final text message, and I know that I got out just in time. Some people might say I overreacted, that I should have given him more of a chance, that leaving someone over thoughts they cannot control is cruel. But those people have never felt what I felt. They have never had to choose between empathy and survival. I chose survival. And I would make the same choice again. My graduating class from nursing school had their 10-year reunion last spring, which puts into perspective how long I spent believing I had found the perfect relationship. I had been working as a dental hygienist at a family practice in Albuquerque, New Mexico, for about 2 years when I matched with Vincent on a dating app. He had this disarming smile in his photos and a bio that mentioned loving rescue dogs and hiking in the Sandias. Our first date lasted 5 hours. Dinner turned into drinks, turned into walking around Old Town until the shops closed. He listened like nobody had ever listened to me before, asking follow-up questions, remembering every detail. When he texted me the next morning with a reference to an obscure movie I had mentioned loving as a kid, I thought I had hit the jackpot. I told my sister Noelle that this one felt different. She warned me that charm could be a mask, but I laughed her off. 6 months into the relationship, Vincent had basically moved into my apartment. It happened gradually, a toothbrush here, a drawer there, until one day I realized most of his clothes were in my closet. I did not mind at first because everything still felt like a dream. He would have coffee ready when I woke up, knew my work schedule better than I did, and always seemed to anticipate what I needed before I asked. But then the small things started piling up in ways I could not ignore. He mentioned a conversation I had with my best friend Wendy over the phone, a private call I took in my car during lunch break. When I asked how he knew about it, he shrugged and said I must have told him. I knew I had not. That night, I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling fan spinning slowly above our bed, trying to convince myself that I was being paranoid. The incidents kept accumulating like drops of water filling a bucket. One Wednesday, I decided on a whim to stop by a bookstore after work, a place I had never been to, chosen completely at random because I passed it on my way home, and the window display caught my eye. I spent maybe 40 minutes browsing, bought a paperback novel, and drove home. When I walked through the door, Vincent looked up from his laptop and asked if I found anything good at the bookstore. I had not told him I was going. I had not texted anyone about it. The decision had been entirely spontaneous, made in the span of 3 seconds while sitting at a red light. I asked him how he knew, and he gave me this look, patient, almost amused, and said my car had been parked there for a while, so he assumed. I did not ask how he knew where my car was parked. Some part of me was already too afraid of the answer. A week later, I tested him without meaning to. My coworker Jill invited me to her daughter's birthday party on Saturday afternoon, and I mentioned it to Vincent over dinner, telling him it started at 3. The party actually started at 2. I wanted to see if he would slip up, if he somehow knew the real time from somewhere other than me. Saturday came, and around 1:30, Vincent casually mentioned that I should probably start getting ready since the party started in half an hour. My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. I had told him 3 o'clock. I specifically remembered saying 3. He saw my face and quickly added that he must have misheard, that he thought I said 2. But the way his eyes flickered, just for a fraction of a second, told me he knew exactly what he had done. That night, after he fell asleep, I went through my phone with trembling fingers, checking every app, every setting, looking for something I could not name but knew had to be there. I found it buried 3 screens deep in my location settings, an app I did not recognize, disguised with a generic icon that looked like a system utility. When I searched the name online, my chest tightened so hard I thought I might pass out. It was tracking software, the kind marketed to parents who want to monitor their teenagers, but used by people like Vincent for something far more sinister. It logged my GPS location every 30 seconds. It recorded my text messages, my calls, my browsing history. It could even activate my microphone remotely. The app had been installed 8 months ago, which meant it had been on my phone since our 2nd month of dating, back when he would borrow my phone to look something up or take a photo of us together. I sat on the bathroom floor at 3 in the morning, reading article after article about stalkerware, about intimate partner surveillance, about women whose lives had been dismantled by someone who claimed to love them. I deleted the app immediately, then realized that might have been a mistake. Vincent acted completely normal the next morning. He made breakfast, kissed my forehead, asked about my plans for the day. I watched his face for any sign that he knew I had found the app, any flicker of awareness that his window into my life had been closed. Nothing. His calm terrified me more than anger would have. I called my sister during my lunch break, whispering in the supply closet at work, telling her everything I had discovered. Noelle did not hesitate. She told me I needed to leave, that this was not love but control, that men like Vincent did not stop at digital surveillance. She offered me her guest room in Denver, said I could stay as long as I needed. I told her I would think about it, but the truth was, I had already made up my mind. That evening, I waited until Vincent left for his weekly poker game with friends. Then I packed 2 suitcases with everything essential and loaded them into my car. I left my keys on the kitchen counter and drove west on I-40 without looking back. The first 2 weeks at Noelle's place felt like emerging from underwater. I got a new phone with a new number, created fresh email accounts, and changed every password I could think of. I blocked Vincent on everything, though I knew he probably had backup ways to find me. My sister lived in a quiet neighborhood with a security system and a German shepherd named Bowie, who barked at every shadow. I started sleeping through the night again. I applied for dental hygienist positions in the Denver area, and even went on 2 interviews that seemed promising. For a brief window, I let myself believe that leaving had been enough, that Vincent would move on to someone else, that my nightmare was over. Then, the flowers arrived. A bouquet of white lilies, my favorite, a detail I had mentioned once during our first month together, delivered to my sister's front door with a card that said only, "I understand you needed space. I can wait." There was no sender name, no return address, but the message was clear. He knew exactly where I was. I called the police that same afternoon, shaking as I explained the situation to an officer who looked barely old enough to drink. He took notes, nodded sympathetically, and told me there was not much they could do about flowers. No direct threat had been made, no law had been broken. He suggested I document everything and consider a restraining order, though he warned me those were difficult to obtain without evidence of physical danger. I wanted to scream at him that the danger was real, that Vincent had been inside my phone for months, that he had driven 6 hours to find my sister's address without me telling a single person where I was going. But I kept my voice steady and thanked him for his time. That night, Noelle and I went through her house inch by inch, checking for anything unusual. We found it in her living room, a small device the size of a button battery, stuck to the underside of the coffee table. Vincent had been inside the house. He had been close enough to plant a listening device while we slept, or while we were at work. Noelle called a locksmith at 11 at night, and neither of us closed our eyes until every lock in the house had been replaced. The next few days blurred into a haze of paranoia and exhaustion. I started noticing things I had overlooked before. A car that seemed to idle too long at the end of the block. A man in a baseball cap walking past the house twice in 1 hour. The sensation of being watched even when I was alone in a room with the blinds drawn tight. Noelle took time off work to stay with me, and we developed a routine of checking every window latch, every door lock, every corner of every room before settling in for the night. I filed for a restraining order, gathering every piece of evidence I had. Screenshots of the stalkerware app, photos of the listening device, the card that came with the flowers. The judge granted a temporary order, which meant Vincent was legally required to stay 500 feet away from me and have no contact whatsoever. When he was served with the papers, he did not contest them. He did not show up to the hearing. His silence felt like a predator waiting in tall grass, patient and certain that his moment would come. 3 weeks after the restraining order was issued, I received an email to my new address. The one I had created specifically to escape him. The one I had only used for job applications and communication with my sister. The subject line was empty. The body of the message contained a single photograph. Me, sitting in Noelle's kitchen that same morning, drinking coffee in my pajamas. The photo was taken through the window above the sink, shot from the backyard at an angle that suggested he had been crouched behind the fence. I could see the timestamp embedded in the image file, 7:42 in the morning, exactly when I remembered standing at that counter. I showed the photo to the police, to the detective now assigned to my case, to anyone who would listen. They increased patrols in the neighborhood. They took the restraining order violation seriously. But Vincent was a ghost. His apartment in Albuquerque had been vacated. His car was registered to an address that turned out to be an empty lot. His phone number was disconnected. On paper, he had ceased to exist, but I knew he was out there, circling closer, waiting for the moment my guard slipped. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Noelle's neighbor, a retired electrician named Howard, mentioned that he had seen a cable company van parked on the street several times over the past month, always in the early morning, always gone by the time anyone was fully awake. He thought it was strange because nobody on the block had scheduled any service calls. I passed the information to the detective, a woman named Arlene Kendall, who had started treating my case like a personal mission. She pulled traffic camera footage from the area and traced the van to a rental company in Colorado Springs. The credit card used for the rental belonged to a man named David Merritt, a name I had never heard. But when Detective Kendall showed me his driver's license photo, the air left my lungs in a single painful rush. It was Vincent. Different hair, glasses I had never seen him wear, but unmistakably him. He had created an entirely new identity to continue watching me. The police issued a warrant that same day, and within 48 hours they found him in a motel room 12 miles from my sister's house, surrounded by printed photographs of me, detailed logs of my daily movements, and equipment I could not even identify. Vincent was arrested and charged with stalking, violation of a protective order, identity fraud, and illegal surveillance. The trial took place 8 months later, and I sat in that courtroom for 3 days, listening to prosecutors describe the scope of what he had done. The stalkerware on my phone had captured over 4,000 hours of audio. He had cloned my email accounts, my cloud storage, my social media. Everything I thought was private had been an open window for him to climb through. His defense attorney argued that he was mentally ill, that his obsession stemmed from a genuine belief that we were meant to be together. The jury did not buy it. They convicted him on all counts, and the judge sentenced him to 7 years in state prison. I moved to a different city after the trial, somewhere I will not name, somewhere I have tried to build a life that does not revolve around looking over my shoulder every second of every day. Some nights I still wake up at 3 in the morning, heart pounding, certain that I heard a noise outside my window. I check my phone for unfamiliar apps more often than I care to admit. The locks on my doors are the best money can buy, and I never park in the same spot twice. Vincent taught me that love can be a disguise, that attention can be a cage, and that some people will dismantle your entire sense of safety just to keep you close. I survived him, but I am not sure I will ever stop running. The year everything shifted. Life looked ordinary from the outside. Work had settled into a predictable rhythm. Evenings were quiet, and the relationship I was in had already lasted long enough to feel permanent. Friends knew us as the steady couple, the ones who didn't fight in public and showed up together to birthdays and holidays. I shared an apartment with someone I trusted deeply, someone who had once felt like a safe place after long days. Back then, my biggest worries were money and the feeling that my career had stalled. Nothing about my routine suggested danger, and that's probably why it took me so long to notice how much was changing inside our walls. The setback came quietly, not as a dramatic collapse, but as a slow unraveling. A professional disappointment hit harder than I expected, and it bruised my confidence in ways I didn't know how to explain. The person I lived with reacted differently than I imagined, becoming unusually attentive at first, then oddly controlling in subtle ways. Questions started sounding less like concern and more like monitoring. Comments about my schedule, my phone, even the way I dressed began slipping into conversations disguised as jokes. None of it was loud or explosive, just a steady pressure that made home feel smaller each day. Friends were the first to notice something I couldn't fully articulate yet. I stopped answering messages quickly and started canceling plans without clear reasons. When I did show up, I was quieter, distracted, always checking the time. A close friend, Noah, asked once if everything was okay, and I remember brushing it off with a tired laugh. It was easier to downplay than to explain the constant tension that followed me around. I didn't have a single incident to point to, just a growing sense that I needed to be careful all the time. Inside the apartment, the atmosphere kept tightening. Doors were closed more often, conversations happened in lowered voices, and silence became a kind of warning. Small disagreements lingered far longer than they should have, stretched into hours of cold distance. I began memorizing routines, learning which topics to avoid and when to stay quiet. The relationship hadn't turned violent in any obvious way, which made it harder to name what was happening. Still, every day ended with the same thought. Whatever this had become, it wasn't what it used to be. What changed next didn't announce itself with shouting or slammed doors. It showed up in rules that were never spoken out loud. Certain friends suddenly became bad influences, according to casual comments dropped during dinner. If I stayed out later than expected, the mood at home shifted into something sharp and punishingly quiet. Personal things moved slightly from where I remembered leaving them, just enough to make me doubt myself. I began keeping track of tiny details without realizing why, like the position of keys or whether a light had been left on. Sleep came in fragments, and mornings felt heavier than they should have. Home no longer reset me. It drained me. The sense of being watched grew, even during moments that used to feel private. The fear didn't arrive all at once, which is what made it so confusing. It accumulated in my chest during ordinary moments like standing at the sink or scrolling through my phone. Certain questions started carrying consequences, and wrong answers led to long, suffocating evenings. I learned how to speak carefully, choosing words the way someone picks their steps on ice. Apologies became frequent, even when I wasn't sure what I was apologizing for. I stopped trusting my own reactions and relied instead on predicting theirs. The relationship had become a maze, and I was constantly trying not to hit the walls. Nothing dramatic happened, yet every day ended with relief that it was finally over. Friends kept checking in, and I kept deflecting. One of them, Marlon, noticed bruises under my eyes from lack of sleep, and asked again if I felt safe. The word safe stuck with me longer than the conversation itself. I laughed it off, saying things were just stressful at home, that everyone goes through rough patches. What I didn't say was how my body reacted to the sound of the front door opening. I didn't mention how my phone battery dying made my pulse spike. Admitting fear felt like betrayal, not just of my partner, but of the version of my life I'd presented to everyone else. So I stayed quiet and hoped it would pass. The day authorities became involved didn't start any differently than the others. Routine carried me through the morning, right up until a moment where the tension finally spilled beyond the apartment walls. A neighbor had heard raised voices and called for help, something I'd never done myself. When officers asked questions, my first instinct was still to minimize, to protect, to smooth things over. Then one of them asked how long I'd felt afraid. The answer surprised me as it left my mouth. Months, not days, not weeks, but months of slow, silent erosion. Saying it out loud made the truth impossible to ignore. Once the truth surfaced, everything moved faster than I was prepared for. Statements were taken, questions repeated in different ways, and suddenly my private life felt exposed under fluorescent lights. I remember sitting on a stiff chair, hands clasped together trying to explain something that had never had a single starting point. There was no dramatic incident to describe, just a pattern that had slowly reshaped my days. The officers listened carefully, and one of them said something that stayed with me. Harm doesn't always leave visible marks. Hearing that felt validating and devastating at the same time. It meant what I'd lived through was real, but it also meant I'd been living in danger longer than I wanted to admit. Leaving the apartment didn't happen in a dramatic rush. It was methodical, almost clinical. I packed essentials while someone else stood nearby, making sure nothing escalated. Familiar objects looked different when I knew I wouldn't be coming back to them. The couch where I'd spent countless evenings felt foreign, like it belonged to someone else's life. My partner barely spoke, and that silence felt heavier than any argument we'd ever had. Walking out with a bag over my shoulder felt unreal, like stepping off a stage after a performance that had gone on far too long. Relief came in waves, mixed with guilt I couldn't fully explain. In the weeks that followed, friends filled in the quiet spaces I hadn't realized were empty. Conversations happened slowly, carefully, as if everyone was afraid of saying the wrong thing. I started noticing how tense my body had been, how simple things like sleeping through the night now felt like small victories. Therapy helped me understand how control can disguise itself as concern, how fear can become normalized when it grows gradually. I replayed moments from the past months and saw them differently, clearer, sharper. The danger hadn't appeared overnight. It had been assembling itself piece by piece while I adjusted instead of resisted. Today, I share this because I know how easy it is to miss the signs when nothing looks violent on the surface. What happened to me wasn't sudden, and that's what made it so dangerous. If someone had asked me earlier whether I was in trouble, I would have said no without hesitation. Now I know better. Safety isn't just the absence of bruises or shouting. It's the presence of peace. I'm still rebuilding, still learning to trust my instincts again. But I'm out. And even though I don't understand exactly when the line was crossed, I'm grateful I didn't wait any longer to leave. Living in a mid-sized apartment complex meant learning the rhythms of other people's lives whether you wanted to or not. At the time this happened, I was working irregular hours and sleeping lightly, always half aware of doors slamming or voices echoing through the courtyard. That night had the heavy quiet that usually settles after midnight, the kind where even small noises travel too far. I was scrolling on my phone on the couch, lights off, when raised voices cut straight through the walls. It wasn't playful arguing or drunk laughter, but sharp, brittle shouting that sounded rehearsed from long practice. I recognized the voices from the unit across the hall, a couple named Mason and Lily who had moved in months earlier. They were polite in passing, but the tension between them always lingered like a smell you couldn't place. Hearing them fight wasn't new, but the intensity that night felt different, more focused, like something had finally snapped. The argument spilled into the hallway, their door thrown open so hard it bounced against the frame. Mason's voice was loud enough that I could make out full sentences, accusations piling up without pause. Lily replied in shorter bursts, her tone clipped and controlled, which somehow made it worse. A few other doors cracked open an inch or two, just enough for eyes to peek through the dark. I stayed still, listening, telling myself not to get involved, the way everyone does in shared buildings. At one point, something heavy hit the wall inside their apartment, followed by a sharp thud on the floor. Then came a sudden stop, as if someone had flipped a switch. The door closed slowly this time, clicking into place with an oddly careful sound. After that, nothing. No footsteps, no voices, just the hum of the building settling back into itself. Sleep never really came after that. My mind kept replaying the last few seconds, especially how deliberate that door sounded when it shut. Morning light crept in through the blinds, and by then the whole thing already felt unreal, like a bad dream fading at the edges. When I stepped into the hallway to take out trash, Mason was there, leaning against the wall and staring at his phone. He looked exhausted but strangely calm, too calm for someone who'd been screaming hours earlier. He nodded at me and mentioned, casually, that Lily had taken off during the night after their fight. According to him, she grabbed a bag and left to cool down, something she'd done before. The way he said it felt practiced, like a line repeated until it sounded true. I remember thinking how odd it was that I hadn't heard the door open again. Later that day, the mood in the building shifted as quiet questions started circulating. One neighbor mentioned checking the security feed after realizing their car had been scratched overnight. The cameras covered the hallway and main exit, and curiosity turned into unease when people noticed gaps in the timeline. Lily never appeared leaving the building, not on foot, not through the garage, not anywhere the cameras could see. Someone else pointed out that her phone hadn't pinged outside the complex after the argument, based on a shared family plan notification. By evening, police were walking the halls, asking measured questions and taking notes. Standing in my doorway, watching them disappear into Mason's apartment, I felt a creeping certainty that the silence after that door closed wasn't empty at all. The next day blurred into a strange waiting period, like everyone in the building was holding their breath without admitting it. Officers returned with more questions, this time slower and more precise, asking about sounds, timing, even the way the argument ended. I told them about the hallway, the object hitting the wall, and how the door closed softly instead of slamming. One of them wrote that down and paused longer than the others, his pen hovering as if he didn't want to commit it to paper yet. Mason stayed inside his unit most of the day, curtains drawn, refusing to open the door unless prompted by police. When he did step out briefly to smoke, his movements were controlled, almost careful, as if every gesture was being rehearsed in his head. The story about Lily leaving stayed the same, word for word, no matter who asked. That consistency should have been reassuring, but it only made my unease deepen. By the following evening, the building manager mentioned that maintenance had been asked to check the plumbing in Mason's unit. Apparently, a neighbor below complained about unusual noises in the pipes during the night of the argument. I watched from my doorway as two maintenance workers went in with tool bags and came out quieter than they'd gone in. One of them wouldn't meet anyone's eyes, just shook his head slightly when the manager whispered something to him. Shortly after, the police arrived again, this time with gloves and sealed evidence bags. The air in the hallway felt thicker, like the walls were listening. Mason was escorted out, hands free but flanked closely, his face still calm in that unsettling way. As he passed me, he gave a quick nod, the same polite gesture he always used, and it made my chest tighten for reasons I couldn't explain. That night, sleep was impossible again, but for different reasons. My phone buzzed with messages from neighbors sharing fragments of what they'd heard from friends or overheard in stairwells. Someone mentioned phone records showing Lily's last call ended minutes after the door closed. Another said the security footage had been manually accessed around the same time, something only residents could do with the right code. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every sound from that night, wondering which ones I'd dismissed too quickly. The argument, the thud, the silence, all of it rearranged itself into something darker the more I thought about it. It struck me how normal the evening had felt before the shouting started, how easily a life could slip sideways without warning. Knowing I'd been just a wall away made the memory cling to me in an uncomfortable, personal way. The resolution came quietly, without the dramatic announcements people expect. Weeks later, the building received a brief notice confirming Mason had been charged, and that Lily's disappearance was no longer considered voluntary. Details were scarce, but enough leaked to confirm what most of us already suspected about what happened after that door closed. Life in the complex returned to its routine, New tenants moved in, and conversations shifted to safer topics. Still, every now and then I catch myself listening too closely to the hallway at night, counting footsteps and door clicks. That careful sound of the lock turning has stayed with me more than the shouting ever did. Taught me how thin the line is between overhearing an argument and witnessing the beginning of something irreversible. Even now, thinking back on that day, it's the small details that refuse to fade. The way the hallway light flickered slightly after the door shut, like it hesitated. The smell of someone's burned dinner drifting through the vents minutes later, absurdly normal. I remember standing in my kitchen that morning, coffee going cold in my hands, staring at the wall we shared and trying to convince myself I was overthinking everything. Part of me wanted to believe Mason's version because it was easier, because it let the night stay contained. Accepting the alternative meant admitting I'd been close to something final and hadn't done a thing. That realization carried a quiet guilt that settled deep and stayed there. I replayed every choice I made during that night. Every moment I decided to stay put instead of stepping into the hall. It wasn't bravery that stopped me, just routine, the unspoken rule that you don't involve yourself in other people's messes. Friends I talked to later said the same thing. They wouldn't have done anything either. Still, that didn't make it easier to live with. The knowledge that Lily's last moments likely happened feet away from me turned the apartment into something unfamiliar. Sounds carried differently after that, each muffled noise charged with meaning. I started keeping my TV louder at night, not for entertainment, but to drown out the building itself. Eventually I moved out, not dramatically, just a lease ending and a quiet decision not to renew. On my last day there, I stood in the empty hallway for a moment, listening to the echo of my own footsteps. Mason's unit was sealed and dark, a small notice still taped crookedly to the doorframe. New people would eventually live there, unaware of what had unfolded behind those walls. I wondered if they'd ever sense it the way the air seemed heavier around that door. Leaving didn't erase the memory, but it gave it boundaries, a place I could point to and say, that happened there, not here. What stays with me most isn't fear, but awareness. That night taught me how ordinary horror can look until it's already finished. No warning signs flashing, no clear moment where intervention feels obvious. Just raised voices, a door closing, and a story that almost worked. I still think about Lily sometimes, about how easily she vanished from everyone's daily routine before the truth surfaced. Sharing this now isn't about closure, because I don't think that ever really arrives. It's about not letting that silence be the final thing remembered.